Today I'm speaking with Darrel Ray. Darrel, thank you so much for joining me today.
Good to be here, Tim. Kind of looking forward to this for quite a while. I've been watching your channel off and on for a long time. You don't know I've been spying on you, so
Thank you.
good
I'm
to
very
finally
honored.
be here.
Awesome. I'm very honored. I did not know that. Um, well,
Yep.
th- just to give a quick bio here before we jump in, Dr. Darrel Ray has been a psychologist for over 30 years. He focused on counseling and clinical psychology for 10 years, then moved into organizational psychology and consulting. He's been a student of religion most of his life. He holds a master's degree in religion as well as a bachelor's in sociology and anthropology, and he has a doctorate in psychology. He focuses often on topics such as workplace organizational culture, secular sexuality, and the treatment of religion-induced trauma. He's a public speaker, podcaster, and atheist activist, among other things. He's the founder of the nonprofit organizations Recovering from Religion and the Secular Therapy Project. And he did have a podcast for a while about human sexuality and atheism called Secular Sexuality. We'll have the link beneath this video for that. He's also an author. He's got books such as Teaming Up, Making the Transition to a Self-Directed Team-Based Organization, The Performance Culture, Maximizing the Power of Teams, The God Virus, How Religion Affects Our Lives and Culture, and Sex and God, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. He is also the father of two children and a grandfather. So that's what I know about you so far, but tell us more about yourself and maybe some of your hobbies.
Well, I enjoy being retired right now. I've been retired for a few years and doing recovering from religion stuff. I would say full time. I work harder now than I did sometimes when I had a real job. My big hobby, I guess, in my life is mountain climbing. I've climbed 50 of the highest mountains in the continental United States.
Wow.
I plan on going out. I try to go out once a year and climb one or more mountains. So that's that's what my passion is, getting to the top of mountains, and mainly in Colorado.
Do you ever
But
get
I
over to Europe or anywhere else for those mountains?
I have never hiked in Europe extensively. A little bit in England, but no, mainly United States. I've hiked all over the United States. I've hiked in the Appalachian Mountains,
That's
all over
awesome.
New Mexico, Colorado. Little. We just went out and saw the redwoods in Redwood National Forest, and we hiked a little bit in that area
Hmm.
earlier this year. That was amazing. I'd never been to the redwoods, so that was mind-boggling, magical. But my partner and I agreed it was magical, and we've never seen a forest like that.
Hmm. That's
So
awesome.
anyway, pretty
You're
cool. Yeah.
mentioning some things on my bucket list. I want to get there and also do the whole Appalachian Trail at some point. It's
Oh, yeah. I didn't do the whole Appalachian Trail, but I have done the entire Appalachian Trail within the Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I have hiked the full length there.
hmm,
But to hike that whole 2,000 miles is just crazy. I
yeah.
have friends that have done it, but it takes you 3.5 months to do it if you succeed. It's tough.
I bet.
And it's a little tougher than I want to take on. I did have a goal when I was younger to go climb Kilimanjaro in Africa, but I never got that done. I've
Gotcha.
never had an ambition to climb K2 or Everest or any of those kind of mountains. I want to live to see my grandkids grow up. So, and
I
they're
hear you.
they're they're almost grown up, so I better be careful about that. I
I
got a
hear you.
22-year-old grandson and an 18-year-old grandson, so I have seen them grown up, I guess you could say. They're good kids.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So,
Well, in
yep.
terms of the interview today, what we wanted to do, if we could, is because your story is going to be very different from others, we wanted to give you a chance to tell your story relating to Christianity and just your worldview journey. But then, since it's not going to be the typical kind of interview that I do, wanted to focus it, after that, which will be pretty quick. We'll focus it on religious trauma and then also talk extensively about sexuality. So, if you could kick us off with just kind of telling us, how your worldview shaped as a child and how it evolved to where you are today.
I'll give you the short version because I've said it in many places on the interwebs. So you can probably find my story in much more detail. But I was born and raised in Wichita, Kansas. I was My parents were religious. My grandparents were very religious. My grandfather on my dad's side was a country church preacher and Sunday school teacher and everything else, elder. And on my mother's side, same thing, elder, and helped found a church. My parents, as I became a teenager, started planting churches. My parents actually started two churches, both of which are thriving today, or at least appear to be. I don't know the inside story. The church I grew up in, thankfully, went out of business about 10 years ago, and they couldn't find anybody to buy the church. And it took about 3 or 4 years to get somebody to buy it. And there's a bunch of evangelicals. They bought the church for $1 million. said they're going to put $1 million into it, and then they found out that it was in violation of a bunch of EPA regulations because there used to be a gas station there, and it would cost another $1 million. That was like 5 years ago, and they still haven't moved in because they can't find 3 million, well, 2 more million. Anyway,
Hmm.
there's it's like karma, I guess. But anyway, I grew up in that church. I was a son. I was went to church at least 3 times a week, sometimes more. I became a Sunday school teacher when I was in high school. I mean, when I was in early college, and I was very dedicated to. I liked teaching, and I liked religion, so I had a lot of interest in studying the Bible. I participated in Bible bowls. I don't know if you had those when you were in
Oh
young
yeah.
school, but I wasn't very good at it, but because I didn't like memorizing shit. I mean, I like to learn it, but it's a waste of my time to have to memorize all these Bible verses. But all my buddies could do it anyway. But I always seem to do okay on them, and I can still know a ton about the Bible just because you have to if you're going to be a serious, dedicated Christian. But I was a liberal. I was a liberal from the day I was born. I never believed any of the religious fundamentalist stuff, and my I wouldn't say my family is fundamentalist. Uh, they were on they were the moderate edge of fundamentalism. Let's just put it that way. Nobody
Would they
told
have
me
would they have used words like born again and you need to believe the gospel?
oh no, because born again was a Baptist term, and Baptists were going to hell.
Oh
That's
well.
what my grandmother let me know, that Baptists going to hell because they baptize more than once. You can only baptize once. So and we were dunkers. I went to Independent Christian Church, so you have to get dunked there. If you're not dunked, you're not a true Christian, and you can't get dunked twice, or you're not a true Christian. Just saying, that's what my granny taught me. My granny believed that Jesus wrote the King James version of the Bible, so that'll tell you a little bit
Wow.
about it. And I have a funny story that when I was little, when I was early teens, 12, 13 years old, Madeline Murray O'Hare was getting the Supreme Court to, stop forced prayer in schools. And every time her name came on the radio, my granny would say, "That woman's worse than the devil." And it took me quite a while to get the courage up to ask Granny why would, because Granny would, if you sassed her, you'd get a spanking. Switching. You'd have to go out and cut the switch off the tree and bring it in. And you better get a big one because she's going to get a bigger one if you don't. So
That's
one
awful.
day I finally said, "Well, Granny, how can anybody be worse than the devil?" And she said, "Well, at least the devil believes in God." So that was the theological framework. And how do you argue with that framework? It's pretty solid, I guess you could say. Uh,
Hmm.
I believed in evolution since I learned about it. I was about 11 or 12 when I learned about evolution. I thought, wow, this is cool. And I really got into biology. My family hated it. My grandmother and grandfather thought I was learning the wrong things because I was learning about evolution. And they shouldn't be teaching it in school, but even if they hadn't been teaching, I'd learned it. So I loved evolution. I loved biology. I loved science. And so I never bought the party line. I never believed the Bible was literal. It just made no sense to me that it could be literal. So I had this, well, there must be a God. He loves us, whatever. But the hell thing was still an issue. It took me quite a while to realize that was pretty much a control concept.
So you
I
you
went,
you
yeah.
never you never actually got even tempted to really accept that worldview, just not even in the earlier days.
Well, it's hard to know. It's hard to say. What do you really know when you're 16 years old? When you're 18? When you're 21? Even you're just trying to navigate the world, and there's a lot of things that are there that you don't pay a lot of attention to, but they're hanging inside your brain. And I think that's what the health thing was. And as we'll talk about later, I think my own sexuality kept me from getting too deep into, because I like to have sex with or without a partner. I was very um, pro masturbation from early on. I read The Joy of Sex within months after it came out. It was an advocate of self pleasure. So I said, so that piece of it never bothered me that much. I did feel some shame, some guilt, and of course I hid that behavior because it was frowned upon, very frowned upon, of course. But getting married at 20 years old, I had a sexual outlet early on, and that's changed. I noticed a change in my own behavior. I'm a pretty good observer of my own behavior. I find myself a fascinating subject. And so when my behavior shifts in significant ways, and maybe over a long period of time or permanently, it makes me think, well, what just happened there that would, because it's not voluntary. It's not something I sat down and said, okay, I'm gonna stop masturbating, or I'm gonna masturbate 7 times a day or anything like that. It just happens, you know. And what it helped me understand fairly early on in my life was that biology happens. I mean, there's that just happens. So we can have all these intellectual explanations, but the fact was my hormones went up or my hormones went down, or my life situation changed significantly, and that changes behavior and can change it dramatically sometimes.
Could I ask you, you
Uh,
mentioned evolution. Did did understanding and just having as part of your worldview that you are part of the animal kingdom, did that in any way affect your ability to call it more natural?
well, I'll just say that I got um, Jane Goodall's book In the Shadow of Man the month it came out in 1968, and read it. I don't know if you've read the book. It's dated, of course, but it was the first book ever written by a field observer of chimpanzees. So Jane Goodall is in the forests of Africa, studying up close and personal the chimpanzees. And wow, you read that book, you realize just how close chimpanzees are to us, not just genetically but behaviorally. They behave a whole lot like us in so many ways. That just opened my eyes. I love the book. I still do. I even went to, well, I got lots of, I can tell stories all day. I won't do that to you. My story, though, is that evolution and anthropology and primatology were all subjects I was interested in. And how do you have time to study the damn Bible, when you're reading Jane Goodall, or Margaret Mead or other anthropologists? That's why I got my undergraduate degree was in sociology and anthropology. I had a double major. And I would have majored in anthropology alone, except they didn't have a full degree program there. So I ended up taking every anthropology course they had, which was enough for a major. They just didn't offer the major. So I had sociology, anthropology. As you can tell, those are really important subjects. If you ever read my books, you'll see anthropology and sociology and psychology throughout my books. I
Hmm.
just weave, those three disciplines are really, really important. But more, yeah. And then endocrinology, I think, is important. We're learning more and more about, what's going on in the body during various stages of life, and how relationships interact with your hormones. I mean,
Hmm.
we're really animals, and we are really driven by our hormones. And if there's anything I would love people to start grasping is your brain is an adjunct to the rest of your body. It doesn't drive your body. It's a response to your body. And not that we can't have some control. Obviously, we do, and we learn how to control our bodies. But our bodies are doing shit we have no clue about, and then we're behaving in ways that we think we're in control of when in fact we're not. So I don't know. It's hard to explain that without going into a hell of a lot of detail.
Yeah. Well,
Anyway, that's
I do want to get back to the
that's
hormones question. Could I ask just to maybe bring a couple quick questions to wrap up your relationship with Christianity? At what age did you kind of have the self-awareness and the bravery to say, I'm definitely, like, if you're talking to a Christian, no, I definitely disagree with your worldview. I'm not one of you all. What age did that get firmed up in your mind?
uh 38 years old. I got divorced. That was the best thing I could ever do because I was married to a religious spouse and her family was very religious. So
Hmm.
I was more and more and more liberal. And as a couple, we were okay with going to the most liberal church in town, wherever we were living. But the problem was it was still religion and it was still Christianity. I was teaching Sunday school as late as 37 years old. I was the most popular Sunday school teacher. Nobody could get anybody to come to the adult classes in First Presbyterian Church in Leavenworth, Kansas. So I started teaching a course on comparative religions. And I'm not a Presbyterian. I did not belong to that church, but they were desperate. So they let me teach Sunday school, and I was getting, they couldn't get 5 people to show up every Sunday. And then within weeks, I was having 30, 40, 50 people. They had to change my room and give me the biggest room in the church, the meeting room in the church outside the sanctuary. So, and I had a lot of fun teaching comparative religions.
Hmm.
So what I'm saying is by that time, I didn't believe any religion was right. And I was teaching other people how to think critically about religion. So that was 38. Getting divorced at that time was like a huge load off my back, gave me the freedom to get out and
Hmm.
explore my sexuality, especially because that was something I just couldn't open up about until I got rid of that. And it's not like my wife's very liberal and she's very open-minded sexually too. So it wasn't that. It was just the religious stuff was always there, and the notion of sex addiction. I mean, she thought I was a sex addict just because I like porn, because whatever. Anyway, that was her label. Of course, it wasn't a diagnosis. It was her diagnosis. And, in-laws diagnosed. It's all, that whole framework.
Yeah, well, I want to come back to that very shortly on that topic. Just a few quick questions to wrap up the part of your Christian worldview. When you finally came to a point where you were able to have the words to articulate, like, I'm definitely not believing in this system, did you struggle with the question of the afterlife? And did you ever, growing up, kind of think, yeah, there's probably something, I'm probably going somewhere good, hopefully. Did you struggle with the idea that there might not be one? And did you feel like you'd lost anything significant? Just how did you deal with that part of the religious trauma?
That was a very easy thing to get over because I was over it by about 14 years of age, maybe a little bit earlier. I can't remember
Hmm.
what year it was, but my guinea pig died. And when my guinea pig died, I was very sad about my guinea pig. His name was Squeaky, and he would get underneath my chin and just snuggle and squeak, 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 squeak. It was just the most precious thing. When Squeaky died, I asked my mom, "What happens to Squeaky after he dies?" And "Does he go to heaven?" She says, "No, animals don't go to heaven." At that moment, I knew it was bullshit. So I never really believed in heaven at all. Hell's a little harder to get rid of. And the interesting thing we now have research showing that the concept of hell has a different impact on us than I'm talking neurologically,
Yeah.
than heaven does. So yeah, I got over the whole notion of heaven at when over Squeaky, because I'm not going to any place that doesn't have Squeaky at that point in time. That was my life.
It's funny that you say that you got over it so early, because I get comments quite a bit. I would say at least a couple a week on my videos where maybe someone like myself or the interviewee has been in Christianity for 30 or 40 years. And in the conversation, we're basically admitting that it took us 30 to 40 years to conclude this is fiction, this is mythology. And someone's snarky comment will be, it took you 40 years? What the hell? I was out by 8 or 10. And like,
Yeah.
how foolish can you be? But do you feel like as you've gotten into, all the counseling that you've done and the books you've written, just dealing with people with religious trauma, that you're able to understand people, like myself, that literally, until, age 43, I would have said it's all, painfully real. And arguably there could have been many, many pivot points in my life where I could have said, this doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense. Think about it. And I chose to take the path to say, I just doubled down and, it made sure that I was more firm, than ever in my belief. And when there were discrepancies, I would just say, God will explain it in heaven. And hopefully, as you get more mature in your faith, you'll understand it more. You'll get into better scholars who will explain you the scriptures. And then you'll be like, oh, it wasn't a discrepancy at all. Or, oh, you just needed to understand this part of God's nature. And once you did, it made sense again. I kept on finding loopholes and ways to be okay with it for
Mhm.
years. But when you look at someone like yourself, where it didn't take you that long, how do you relate to someone who's in it for decades and couldn't even make serious questions of the worldview?
Because I understand. I'll make this claim. I understand the neurology that's going on. What happens in the brain when someone's indoctrinated, and the long and short of it is early childhood training patterns the brain in very specific ways, for good or ill. If you can pattern the brain through the limbic system to be triggered by fearful images like hell or other things, and supplement that with things like punishment, spanking, abuse, isolation. Then the brain, as I said earlier, that part of the brain's going to take on a life of its own. It is not subject to our intellectual side of our brain. Our prefrontal cortex is a tiny fraction of the overall brain, and it tries to tell us it's in control when it's not in control, not even close to being in control. That's why people get triggered, because patterns of trauma, especially done early in childhood with adverse childhood experiences, which you probably had,
Oh, yeah.
are indelibly stamped into our brains. Now, when I say indelibly, I mean they're there permanently, but it's like an old road in your brain. If out in western Kansas there are highways out there that you can't even see because they've not been used in so many years, the grass is growing up, trees are going out of the middle of the highway, that sort of stuff. It hasn't been used, but it's still there. And even archaeologically, you can see Roman roads that were made 2,000 years ago. And that's kind of the way the brain is. In my brain, I might get rid of the notion intellectually, but the path is still there in my brain. And that path can be triggered or resurrected, if you want to use that term, if the right conditions are available. And those right conditions involved external experiences that impact the brain. And so I was fortunate. I had a very skeptical brain. I'm always asking questions. In fact, that was the irritation of my mother and my grandmother. I'm always asking questions. Why did Jesus have to die? That was a bad question to be asking. Stuff like that. So, but not everybody's like that. And like a lot of children in fact, children better be able to respond to their parents and behave, or they won't be safe. Don't go playing in that forest over there, or the lions will get you. Well, the children that listened to their parents survived. They didn't get eaten by the lions. The children that didn't listen to them aren't around. Their genes didn't get passed on. So there's reasons why children follow their parents very closely, but that can be abused. It can be misused. And what religion has done, as I write about in my book, The God Virus, what religion has done is it's figured out that if we can intimidate and scare the shit out of a kid at 3 years old or 4 or 5 years old, we have them forever. That's what the Jesuit says. Give me the boy till 7, I'll give you the man. That's a 500-year-old statement by the Catholic Jesuits. And that's what's going on with, and everybody's different. I wasn't raised in your environment. I didn't have that kind of intense intimidation coming at me from all angles. And here's the thing that most people don't know about trauma with respect to religion is, if you're raised in a religious household, there is no escape for the child. You can't go in your room, get away from the fear of hell. You can't go play with your friends and be who a normal child would be, especially if those friends aren't Christian, or if they have ideas that are not approved by your family. I mean, I literally could not play. My mother and grandmother strongly discouraged me from playing with kids 4 houses down because they were Catholic.
Hmm.
Now, I did not know what a Catholic was when I'm 7 years old. I just know I liked them. I don't want to go play with them. They were fun kids to play with, but I was not allowed to do that. So, those are things that are impacted strongly in our brains, and we don't just get over them.
Hmm.
That's why I like to really emphasize your intellectual side is a tiny fraction of your deconversion process.
Yeah.
It leads you, it can help you find the place, but you still have a lot of work to stop using those damn roads. Get a new road, take a new path, build a new bridge. And so that's
Yeah.
my sermon for the day.
Well, just to interject from my story side of it, that's one of the biggest things, if I can use the Christian word blessings, one of the blessings that I really feel about the fact that the timing for my deconversion. And I like to say that Jesus wasn't my ultimate savior, my kids were, because we were singing a song called Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho, which is just
Uh-huh.
a fun kid song. You dance around to it
Yeah.
and the walls come tumbling down. But it was the first time in my life, as we're sitting around doing family devotions, that I cringed. And you can probably guess why, is because I knew the rest of the story would eventually be told to them: the genocide, the land theft, the slavery, the child brides, genital mutilation, and just all these horrific things. And I'm
Yeah.
thinking mostly about genocide. I think there may have been some news items at that point about some genocides that have happened in our recent history, or were happening. But just the idea of genocide was heavy on my mind. And it was the first time I ever cringed inside, like, oh my gosh, am I okay with passing this on? Because you're not just going to tell them the story, you're going to tell them our God that we know and love, who's our personal savior, he commanded this, so it must be a good thing. And it was the first time I cringed, and really that's what started a 3-year process of intense study. I didn't leave because of the moral concerns. I eventually, even though arguably I should have, my rationale for leaving was just intense study of the mythology, the comparative mythology kind of stuff. But when I look back at that, I think one of the blessings of that was that they were so young. Getting to your point, my oldest son was 4.5 years old at that time, very impressionable, and
Yeah.
and my little girl was 2 years younger, so she was only about two. And I remember thinking to myself, I am in a really good spot because they're young enough that I can undo the very little damage that they've been exposed to so far, and I can make sure it stops right here and now. And in many ways, even though 4 years passed from that point, there's been a lot of ways in which I have protected their minds so well that even if I were to drop dead today, I think they would have a strong chance of never believing, which is, to me, is just awesome. I love the fact, because I hear stories of people saying, I deconverted too, but it wasn't until my kids were 20. So now I've got to deal with the fact that they think it's real now because I told them it was real, but
Yeah.
it's,
Right.
it's hard.
I think a lot of parents after they deconvert have a certain shame or guilt about having indoctrinated their children. That's normal. It's natural. Unfortunately, it's unfortunate, but you were doing the best you could with the tools you had at the time. So
Yeah.
you have to learn to forgive yourself and move on. And maybe I semi indoctrinated. Well, I did not raise my two children religious. Like I said, we were super liberal, and we didn't. After I got divorced, I didn't even go to church. I didn't take them with me on Sundays. I had about 60 or 70% custody when we first got divorced, first couple of years. Not because of anything bad. It's just that I stayed in the school district and my ex-wife didn't. But that allowed me to do other things on Sunday with my kids. And I was happy to do it. But my daughter, who's very conservative in her mindset, and she was from the day she was born, and my son, who's incredibly wild and exploring in his mindset, it's just two kids couldn't be more different than my two. And I'm sure you've seen this in children. They, my daughter just seemed to want to get Jesus. I mean, she took everything about religion very seriously, went to church camps that we did not recommend or wanted to. And we let her. And as a result, she got deeply infected. Now, that's her life. She makes her choices. I still have a great relationship with her, love the hell out of her, but we just don't talk about religion. And she's not a nutcase, fundamentalist or anything. So she doesn't impose her religion on other people. She doesn't push it politically, which I'm thankful for. My son, on the other hand, he's out doing his thing on the Caribbean Ocean or climbing a mountain or riding a bicycle at 220 miles an hour, motorcycle. So he's a whole different thing. He is not religious at all. And what I learned from my experiment with having two children, and they are experiments in many ways, is that you don't have much control. They go the direction they're going to go. You can try to control them, but more more importantly, you can try to give them the resources to help them find their own way. That's the more important, because
Yeah.
whether I want my daughter to be religious or not is not within my realm of control. I need to get over that.
Hmm. That's awesome. I love
And
to. I try to instill with my kids that message of thought autonomy. Like, I'll compare it. I'll say, if someone wants to give you a hug and you really don't want to, you're allowed to say no. I'll say it's the same way. You're allowed to say no to certain thoughts. And we practice even where I'll say, pretend you have little, like a glass bubble around your head, and I'll say, I'll say you can take your hand and push me out. And I'll say you have to believe just like Daddy, and they'll say no, I don't. I'll say you have to be an atheist. No, I don't. You have to be a Christian. No, I don't. And we practice that a lot because I think it gives them that sense of like I can truly push back if I don't feel comfortable. And I like to include
Yeah,
atheism in that. Like you don't have to be an atheist. This is about
right.
what you want.
Yeah. Well, I hear echoes of Dale McGowan in what you're saying.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I'm right on that count, am I?
I actually have not read that from him, but I wouldn't be surprised. I've heard so many good things about what he does. So
Yeah.
it's definitely. I love those thoughts though, because you really do when you're a fundamentalist, you really do think that the most important responsibility you have is to indoctrinate. You wouldn't call it that, of course, but it's to train them up in the ways of the Lord, and just little soldiers for Jesus, and to be able to reverse that is so powerful. So I love that so many
Yeah.
people are bringing that to the forefront.
There were several things. I mean, I cannot possibly tell you my whole story. I don't even want to actually, but there were several things going on that helped me move out. Number one, trials of some of the criminals from World War II were happening as I'm watching the evening news, and I'm learning about, as you mentioned, the genocides, and that opened my eyes to the fact that these folks were Catholics, these folks were Lutherans perpetrating these kinds of crimes on humanity. At the same time, uh, as I am growing in through my teenage years, the Vietnam War is going on. And at 18 years of it, when I turn 18, I have to go into the draft office and get my draft card. And I'm now subject to being sent to Vietnam. And I went to a Quaker school. It's called Friends University. I wasn't a Quaker, but I had an uncle that was a Quaker, and he was actually on the board of directors of Friends University. So I went to Friends, and there I met a lot of Quaker people. The Quakers, of course, are pacifists. Quakers did not fight in World War I or World War II. And so I learned that philosophy, and it started getting me to read the Bible in a different way. And I realized Jesus was a pacifist. What the hell? And as a result of that, I was still a Christian, liberal and everything at 18, but I was a conscientious objector. I said, look, you read your own damn Bible the way you want to, but here's what the guy actually said. Of course, at that point in time, I still believe there was a Jesus. I don't even believe there was a Jesus now. I'm a mythicist, I guess you could say. Anyway, so that had a huge impact on me because I am reading the Bible. I'm seeing something that nobody else seems to see. And yet the Quakers, the Mennonites, the Amish, they all saw that 500 years ago. What's wrong with us if we can't read that Bible and see that? That that led me to really strong feelings about and I also read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, The Cost of Discipleship.
Yeah.
And reading I did that I went to seminary. I got a 2-year degree, a master's degree, as you said earlier. And I read Bonhoeffer, and in reading Bonhoeffer, I realized, well, hell, the cost of discipleship. What he says in that book basically says it's virtually impossible to be a Christian. I mean, and he was a hero of mine at the time because he literally was a martyr. He died within days of the war ending. He was killed, and I thought, damn, that's just ridiculous. That's an impossible standard. Even he admitted that, and so I never took that. I tried to take the Cost of Discipleship book seriously, but after reading Bultmann and Heidegger and a lot of other theologians, Paul Tillich, had to read the whole damn thing. I took systematic theology at Vanderbilt Divinity School. Now that's like one of the top divinity schools in the whole world. It was right across the street from where I was going to school at Scarrett College for Christian Workers. But I read Paul Tillich's book. It's probably 600 or 700 pages long. At the end of it, I said, I don't know any more than I did when I started this book. There's no knowledge in here. It's just intellectual masturbation is all this is. And that's what I realized at the ripe old age of 22 years old, 23 years old. That's systematic theology. There's nothing there. It's like you pop the balloon and there's just air inside of it.
Yep.
So yeah, anyway.
It's interesting that you mentioned Bonhoeffer. That was a really big part of my upbringing, really, as a young teen. My When I was homeschooled, my mom asked me to, like, in addition to listening to Christian radio that was just kind of always on in our home. She asked me to specifically pick a couple of preachers to listen to for my homeschooling. And I picked a guy named John MacArthur and a guy named Chuck Swindoll. And I listened to them for years.
Oh,
Chuck,
Swindoll. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
Swindoll was more gracious and
Yeah.
balanced, if you could call him that. But John MacArthur was going through at that point a series called The Gospel According to Jesus, which is very much the same concept. And there was a guy, a pastor who, Dr. Jim Boyce at 10th Press in Philadelphia, who was doing some similar things, just saying, if you're a Christian, that you're like, God isn't going to just give you a get out of jail free card. He's going to actually come in and transform your life. And if you're, but it does bring up that question of how much transformation is enough to indicate that you really have the fruit of the Spirit. Like if you do struggle a little bit, can you still be saved? Is it, what's the scale? And a lot of people, myself included, ended up kind of being shaken up to the point of saying, you need to keep on kind of being sure. I mean, you might have been truly saved when you were a little kid, and you can kind of call that your salvation experience, but double check, make sure you're calling and election is sure. And just that happened over and over because there's so much at stake, and yet your sin nature that you think is real, especially in the context of hormones, you're just thinking, oh my gosh, like I'm really struggling here. And is if the Holy Spirit's living in me, shouldn't I be more convicted, both of things to not do, but also things positively to do, like being in prayer more? And you end up in a very much a tailspin emotionally, because you're like, I feel like I'm saved some days. I feel like I'm ultra saved some days, and other days I feel like, wow, like why am I struggling with this? This doesn't make sense. Maybe it's because I'm not saved.
I think there's an interesting framework you're using, and religion has hijacked our hormones in this sense. You're using the word struggle. I'm going to say, damn, I'm horny today because my
Exactly.
hormones are going crazy, or I haven't had sex in a week, or I haven't masturbated this last 24 hours or whatever. That would be, and I learned to go that direction in my 20s. I would just say, okay, this isn't struggling. I'm not struggling with with my sexuality. I am experiencing my sexuality. And now my task is what I want to do with that sexuality. Do I want to go cheat on my wife? Do I want to masturbate today? Do I want to look at porn? That's where the cognitive component of sexuality can come in. But when religion says, no, your sexuality belongs to Jesus and you are struggling, well, what the hell are you struggling with? You're struggling against oxytocin that's flowing through your testosterone or estrogen that's flowing through. You're not struggling with your hormones. That's just what's going on. Your cognitive stuff is struggling with the notion that it's not in control. And
Yeah.
Paul didn't know it, but he says, I do things I don't want to do. And what's that in Corinthians? He talks about not being able to control himself. I'd say, well, Paul, just go have some sex. Celibacy is not for most people.
Yeah.
It's not even for Catholic priests, by the way.
It's crazy. Well, that's a great segue to maybe switch from your story to starting to talk about sexuality. But before we get into that specific subsection, could I ask, when you look at just the religious trauma overall, all kinds of topics, are there certain issues that tend, besides sexuality, that tend to rise to the top to you in terms of your research and your counseling?
Absolutely. Because I help run Recovery from Religion. We have a helpline where you can chat or you can call in. You've heard this from our other volunteers.
I've called it myself at the beginning.
Well, good for you. Thank you. I'm always glad to hear that we were helpful I hope we were helpful to.
Absolutely. Very much so.
Good. Well, we have very well trained volunteers. But three things are very common, and they relate right back to trauma. And of course, sexuality is number one. Hell, fear of Armageddon, fear of isolation, and shunning, social isolation. Or I shouldn't have put those two together. So your sexuality, fear of hell, Armageddon, or whatever that is, and social isolation. Those three are the most common things, I would say. At least, and I've not sat down and done a tabulation recently. I did a few years ago. At least 80% of all our callers and chatters are are calling us about one or more of those three things, and oftentimes all three. I mean, it's how do you separate some of these things? So yes, and those are direct result of adverse childhood experiences within religion, which we now call religious trauma. I mean, why are you so afraid to tell your parents that you no longer believe what they believe? Because they have terrorized you into believing that you will be disfellowshipped, or you will be shunned, or you'll be thrown out of the house, or whatever. And one of the most terrifying things for humans, and the most traumatizing things for humans, is social isolation. That's why solitary confinement is so inhumane. That's why it's one of the best torture devices ever invented. Put somebody in a jail cell with no human contact for about a week, and they will start going nuts. I mean, they will literally lose control, because it's a horrible treatment for an incredibly social species that we are. We've got to have social contact. Recent research showed that just 10 hours of social isolation can cause people to start behaving differently. Just 10
Hmm.
hours. That's a pretty limited amount of social isolation. And all maybe, well, anyway, that's recent research. That's pretty solid research, I think, when I read it earlier.
Yeah, and so many of those things are really related to either the shame or the fear, and the fear of punishment, the hell thing, and your community punishing you for not bowing the knee to the party line. And it's amazing to me how much fear is such a big piece of this. And I think in general, I've said this a lot to people I've interviewed, that the chance to actually deconvert, or the opportunity to deconvert, takes so much bravery, because it's it's ultimately, like, the community is a big deal. But if you really believe this, if this isn't like a Christmas and Easter thing, if you really believe that the Yahweh character is there, and he's been talking to you and loving you, but also upset at you at times, but he's been very real to you. It's almost like you can,
Mhm.
like, see him as if he's just part of your worldview. It's wrapped up in what you see in the world. You see God everywhere, but you think that this God is very, very real, and you have, with your theology, set him in your mind as the ultimate judge. He's the ultimate king. You don't stand in judgment of him ever. He always stands in judgment of you. He's never wrong. You're always wrong. And we will literally bow our knees to him and to Jesus someday. The bravery to say, for the first time maybe in your life, I think I'm going to take the seat of the judge. I'm going to be the one that's going to make the judgment call here. It takes so much bravery. And that's,
It
for
does,
some of
yeah.
us, it's because you're associating at that point words like heresy and apostasy, especially with you're a JW and so forth, where they really emphasize those words. But if you get
Yeah.
this sense that you're a heretic, you're an apostate, you've fallen away, and or often mixing in that the devil's got you now, and that you're literally in danger of hellfire, the bravery it takes is overwhelming. And I really respect people that have gone that route. I've obviously had to take it too, so I know. But for people, especially in the extremely high controlling cults, I'm like, wow, like, I hands off to you. I applaud you, because it's
Yeah.
it's so scary.
It is. It's very scary. And we're going against a deep programming that we had no control over. We don't even know is there oftentimes.
Yeah.
So we work hard our volunteers work hard to help people gently help them explore that. And we give them some metaphors. The whole metaphor of a path in the brain seems to be really, really useful to a lot of people. And there's other aspects I think are helpful. And I'm listening to you, and you've been deeply programmed into Christian ideology. It's clear from your language.
Oh
Okay.
yeah.
I mean, I'm not surprising you here.
It's my first
What
language.
I, one of my, one of my, I think things that helped me the most was comparative religions, studying other, especially anthropology, when you realize that so-called primitive societies living in the deep jungles, almost uncontacted jungles of Central America, Central South America, or New Guinea, they have deities, they have beings that are supernatural, they have ancestors that live in their mind. My ancestor lives in my grandmother, my great grandmother lives in my mind, and she talks to me every day. It's not like I'm even praying to me. She exists as exists, period. And to ask the person, why do you think your grandmother exists? Because she exists. She's in my mind. I talk to her, and there are so many examples of that in so-called primitive tribes. And I use that term very judiciously because they're not primitive, they're just intelligent or more so than we are, of course. But that ability to create agency within our environment, to realize that the dog spirit is going to help me find food today if I'm in a Amazonian culture, or the the bird spirit is going to warn me of danger coming from the sky, a storm or whatever. Those things are as real to them as Jesus was to you. It's the ability of our brain to create agents in our environment because we are constantly projecting our agency onto the world. And to some degree, that's not incorrect. My dog watches me. I mean, I got a great dog. I love her. Her name's Amelia. And she's not allowed in my office while I'm interviewing, but she watches me like a hawk. If I make even one tiny move that she recognizes, it says we're going outside. But she is on it like that. So she has the ability to watch me and understand me and respond to me in ways I don't even realize. I mean, I do things and suddenly she's at the door ready to go outside. I haven't even decided if I'm going outside or not, but she'd already calculated, here's the way, here's what's going to happen. If that's not agency, I don't know what is. And so it's not a far step to say, well, animals have got agency like I do. They can calculate, they can think, they can hunt independently. They do everything I do. So maybe they've got intelligence. And it's helping understanding that about other cultures helped me realize, oh, that's all Jesus is. It's just another ancestor worship. It's just another spirit worship in my environment. And if you actually look at what people are doing, they're doing exactly the same thing with Jesus that they would with the spirit in Japan, in ancient Shinto, religious practices. It's just another way to frame it. It's the same frame. It's the same thing though, just a different framework for it.
Yeah, maybe helps us in a crutch sense. It helps us to feel more connected to what's past and our hope for the future. But it's ultimately still just mythology. It's amazing. I was joking, thinking when you said about your dog thing. My dog is that way with plastic. If there's any rustling of plastic, it's an assumption that you're opening up a package that has a treat for her. So she's right there.
It's overgeneralization, and we all do it. And it's a trigger. I mean, you just triggered that poor dog. She doesn't get a treat because you're messing with her brain.
Exactly.
It's a shortcut that the dog's brain has. I mean, and if it's right, even one out of 10 times, it means treats are coming. That's okay. Be sure you're in the right place for the treat because you don't want the other dogs to get a treat, whether there's another dog or not. But our brains are filled with shortcuts. And in most cases, shortcuts are okay. But if your shortcut is not based on reality, then it will get you in trouble often. And you don't even know you're getting in trouble. So my shortcut, let me go down a rabbit hole here. My shortcut is that when I feel stressed or upset or I'm having trouble in life, I'm going to pray to Jesus. That's my shortcut because I was taught that's the way to get over stress. Well, it does help. There's no doubt about the meditative, the neurological impact of that. But while I'm praying, I'm also not doing anything about the problem. And so I'm praying for you as you deal with your cancer. It ain't helping you get over your cancer. And if I'm praying over my own cancer and I'm not going to the doctor, that shortcut is now harmful for me, or it's harmful for you because you need my help and I'm not helping you. There's tons and tons of shortcuts. They're called heuristics, if you want to know the kind of term for it. And we have to have heuristics. I can't think of everything I'm doing if I'm driving my car down the road. I mean, when you first start driving your car, you're trying to bundle learnings in such a way that you can actually get the car from point A to point B. But as you learn, you gain heuristics. You don't have to think about the stop sign. You don't have to think about looking both ways. There's a lot of things you do and you don't even know you're doing them because you've created these shortcuts. And religion comes along and says, well, here's the shortcut to living a happy life. Or here's a shortcut for knowing you're saved. And here's a shortcut for knowing that you're struggling with your sexuality. And all those things will lead you down a primrose path to misery. And then when you're miserable, you don't know, why am I feeling so bad? Why am I depressed? Why am I, quote, addicted to something? That starts burdening you, and your brain has gone down a rabbit hole. It's gone down a emotional, psychological dead ends, what it amounts to. And you don't know it because you were taught your whole life, this is not a dead end. This is the way to heaven.
Hmm. And I guess that too, if your community, your loved ones around you they're all doing it.
Yeah.
If you don't really have a good reason to second guess yourself, and everyone else is saying, no, you're on the straight and narrow, keep at it, good job. It's
Yep.
very hard to start to really carefully analyze the cognitive dissonance in there. So I love that insight.
So I'd like to talk a little more in depth about some issues or ideas around religious trauma because it's like a lot of things. It's getting used. Everybody's saying, "Oh, I've been traumatized," or "I've been triggered," and all that sort of stuff. Um, I don't think that should be taken light. We should take trauma lightly. What we're realizing more and more in the practice of psychology and research around it, right, in recent years, is that there's more trauma out there than we thought, and there's a lot of things that look, oh yeah, it's just normal, that really aren't. In fact, trauma can oftentimes be seen as an inappropriate response to your environment. And we all know about the war veteran that comes back, and every time a firecracker goes off or a car backfires, they hit the deck thinking they're being shot at. Well, it's an inappropriate response to the current environment. And what we see in adult humans around religious trauma is the same thing. You have an inappropriate response to something in your environment that says that's sinful. You have a sexual thought. You see an attractive person, and you think, "Oh, I'm sinning," and that response then leads you to a sense of guilt and shame, and it takes you down the road of depression, perhaps. I'm a horrible person. I mean, what's the whole notion of Christianity? But you're a worthless piece of crap. Is that what Christianity teaches? And sooner or later, you might start believing that. And so, research going back about 20 years or even farther, basically starting out of the Vietnam War veterans coming out and trying to understand what is going on here. Why are these soldiers coming back? World War I, we called it shell shock. World War II, we called it battle fatigue. And then, later in Vietnam, we started identifying as PTSD. And the research that went into that finds that the brain can be patterned very fast. If a IED goes off and kills your two buddies in the Humvee in front of you in Afghanistan, that can have a major impact on you. And it's not the explosion, maybe, because the explosion may not have affected you, but the visual effect of seeing people you had a relationship with get killed. Well, we know that can have a profound impact on an adult brain, and it needs very specific treatment methods to help that person move on from that. And those methods have only been developed in the last 10 to 15 years. I would say even within the last 5 years, certainly in the last 10 years, these new methods have come about. And they've been focused on how do you help soldiers. The U.S. government put a lot of money into this, but and for good reason. We need to help these people. They become, they're living homeless right now on the street because nobody's giving them proper mental health care for an issue that was caused by the war they were forced to go into, or volunteer to go into. It's not always a forced situation. So that's the framework that the U.S. government and other organizations have given us now. We've got good treatment methodologies for trauma. And what's that got to do with religious trauma? Well, a second set of research came out in the late 2000s, early 2010s, on something we now call adverse childhood experiences. And there's a whole bunch of research that's been validated in hundreds of ways by the Center for Disease Control. You can even get online and just Google it. You'll find it right. It's a little test, 9 or 10 questions, and it doesn't diagnose trauma. That is not the purpose, but it's a little test that'll help you understand if you're exposed to potentially trauma-inducing conditions as a child. So the bomb going off in Afghanistan to an adult is, we understand that. But what's the equivalent of a bomb to a 3-year-old, to a 5-year-old? And there's just so much research now that we've going back actually 80 years that shows that what appears to be trivial to an adult can be traumatic to a child and can literally entrap their brain for the rest of their life if they're not given proper treatment. And these are called adverse childhood experiences. Go take the survey, the test, if you want to know more about this. And those things can be loss of a parent at an early age. This could be watching some traumatic event like your pet getting killed, standing in the front yard, watching your dog get run over by a car. Those things could be traumatic to a child, just like it could be traumatic, the thing we talked about with adults in Afghanistan. So that is adverse childhood experiences. The way that relates to religion, and this is my pet peeve right now with current research, is that unfortunately, even Dr. Van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, there is no mention of religion as a potential trauma-inducing experience for children. That is a big pet peeve of mine, because if you, as a clinician for years, seeing patients come into me or interacting with other therapists who are seeing patients, I didn't have a word for it until Dr. Merlene Winnell invented the term about 2010. She came to me during a conference and said, "Hey, I've got this idea." And she tells me her idea and says, and the words religious trauma come out of her mouth and instantly into my brain. I thought, oh my God, I've seen this for years and had no words for it. Those 2 words changed my life at that moment. This was 2010, I think, is when I met her at the conference. I thought, that's what I've been seeing for years. We now have a word for what we're seeing. And she had been seeing us in her own clinical practice. People come in and they're responding inappropriately to their environment. So that's clue number 1, that we've got potential trauma here. Why are you so upset about simply hearing church bells ring? I mean, that might be a clue that you got trauma, or other simple things that most people would not respond to in that way. Just like the soldier hitting the ground as a result of a firecracker is inappropriate, responding to your environment when you see a Bible in a bookstore and you get upset about it, or you feel some cringe, or you feel some shame, or I could sit here and give you example after example, of course. So religious environments have the advantage, home environments, homeschooled as you were, of trapping the child in a way that their brain cannot escape. There is no escape when your education includes having to watch 2 damn preachers every day or whatever you had to do. You can't go in your room and look up evolution on the computer or you'll get in trouble. You can't go play with your Hindu friends that live in the next block or you'll get in trouble. Your brain is trapped, and brains don't like to be trapped. As a result of being trapped and forced into a mold, it causes trauma, or it can cause trauma. I want to be real clear here. Just because you experience these things does not mean you are traumatized. You've been exposed to trauma-inducing environmental influences. There's a big difference, because you might be raised in that very fundamentalist environment, but you have a cool aunt that you can go visit every now and then, and she doesn't give a shit about Jesus. And you realize, oh, there's another way to live. Well, that outlet lets your brain go there occasionally. You can go visit her once a week or once a month, and that allows your brain to be to see the light at the end of the tunnel. When I get to be 18, I can get out of this place. So in that case, those are called mitigating circumstances. Two people in the same family can be subjected to the same trauma-inducing environment. One never experiences the trauma, the other is lifelong impacted by it. And that's just, we see this in all sorts of ways.
I was
The
thinking
second
too,
thing I want to
I was thinking
go
for
ahead.
Christmas, I think I see it a lot there where someone like myself who's been a Christian and someone else who's been a Christian, we both deconvert. I can look at Christmas and thoroughly enjoy it. I think Christmas is one of the best times of the year. But someone else is like, I don't want anything to do with this. And I saw that a lot recently in this past holiday.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I know people who go ballistic over Christmas trees or Christmas music. My partner hates going in the store when there's Christmas music playing, and she was never a Christian. She just hates Christianity.
Hmm.
she
It's amazing
she
how that works. And I'm from the same kind of background of I could be traumatized by it, but I love Christmas and I don't mind the
yeah.
music at all. It's really weird how that works.
There's one other little point that I think is important, and that is when you're learning a language at the age of born to age 5, your brain is programmed. Our brains are programmed to absorb whatever language is in our environment. If you're raised in Switzerland, it's highly possible you would know French, German, and Italian. You could know and have all those languages in your mind at the same time because your brain just absorbs like a sponge. And then about 12 years old, the brain starts closing that window down, the language acquisition window down. It becomes harder and harder to learn new languages as you get older. Some people are lucky in that they got a facility for learning at any age, but most of us normal people don't. I'm among the worst. I just couldn't learn another language at all when I was in college. So at the same time you're learning a language, you're also learning religion, which is a language in many ways. So you're absorbing whatever the religion is around you at the same time as you're absorbing a language. And you're totally unconscious about this. You don't wake up one day and say, Mom, Dad, why aren't you teaching me Chinese? You don't wake up one day and say, Mom, Dad, why aren't you teaching me Buddhism? That's just not even in the ballpark. So whatever you're being taught, how would you unlearn English if that was your primary language? It would be very hard to unlearn it. I mean, I know you might lose some of the more fine-tuned language skills if you didn't use it for 50 years. Chances are you won't lose English, and you're not going to lose Catholicism. You're not going to lose Pentecostal. Whatever you were raised in, that is embedded in your brain just like religion was. And so you have to repattern your brain, get around that potential. Well, if it was traumatizing, you have to repattern your brain, get around that. And that's what I want people to understand is it's a function of where you were at what point in your life and what your brain was doing at that point in time. And that your brain was in the process of absorbing important information for survival in that environment. And to survive in a homeschool environment, you better learn your Bible lessons. As much as if you're surviving in a hunter-gatherer society, you better learn how to make a flint arrowhead, or you're not going to survive. There's learning that's important in those particular environments. But as you get older and you leave those environments, that's when the inappropriate response to the environment happens. Why do I feel bad that I didn't pray this morning when I got out of bed? Why do I feel bad that I didn't my Bible lesson? That's an inappropriate response to the environment when you're 25 years old or 40 years old.
One interesting side effect too of that, of just thinking through what you're talking about, I think, is that you do get to a point where you give yourself, on this side of deconversion, you give yourself the grace and the freedom to say, to just admit this was so all encompassing. And it's like
Yeah.
the whole thing I started with before of people saying, why didn't you get out earlier? It wasn't as obvious that this was not a cohesive worldview and its mythology, but like you are doing the best you could at the time. And it isn't like you're not culpable, especially if you become a leader in the church. You are culpable at some point, but it still helps you to forgive yourself to say, at the time, this was the best I could do. This was my mother tongue. This was what everybody was telling me. And therefore, it really was a difficult thing to see past the curtain, to see the wizard back there. And you just thought this was reality. And I think part of my deconversion healing is just to say, yeah, you needed to make amends to the people, especially as an adult, that you tried to teach. And I've tried to do that. I've connected with some people and apologized for teaching them the Bible. But at the same point, to say, especially as a younger person, like this was the best you could do. Forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for you didn't know any better. And you were, a lot of this information that we would now call critical information was intentionally kept from us. And even, they poisoned the well, like don't look down that well. That's
Yeah.
bad stuff there, like evolution. And you get to a point where you just say, I need to admit I made some really bad choices and I'm responsible for them. But also this at the time, it felt like the best I could do with what I had. And you have to forgive yourself and move on.
Yeah, and you can even talk more and or frame it a little bit differently. You didn't make bad choices. You made choices within a framework. What that framework was an inappropriate response to the environment, to the bigger environment. It was the appropriate response within the immediate environment, and
Yeah.
inappropriate response to the bigger environment. For example, a Jehovah's Witness who's doing everything they can to survive within a Jehovah's Witness framework by not going to college, by not getting an advanced education. That so that is that could be an inappropriate response in the bigger world, but it's a perfectly appropriate response in the smaller world. I think that is
Hmm.
important for people to frame it. Where were you at the time, and what was your world? Not your worldview. That's not the issue. What was your world? Your world was high degree of negative consequences if you don't. So you're doing everything you can to survive appropriately within this worldview. Now, break that egg, uh, that cosmic egg, the cosmos of Jehovah's Witnesses or Baptists or whatever it is, or Hinduism, and suddenly you have a bigger world and you have to start responding in a different way to that world. That's where inappropriate responses start having other consequences. You don't even know it because you were raised to respond appropriately in this world, not in this world. Anyway, that's the way I try to explain it to people. And so to our viewers and listeners right now, I would say if you're having consistently seeing yourself inappropriately responding to your new world, get therapy. Go find somebody who can help you learn the new world, help you respond to the new world appropriately. And this will lead us straight into sexuality because I see so much inappropriate response to the bigger world in terms of sexual mating habits, courting habits, uh, ideas around sexuality, ideas around porn addiction. Those are all inappropriate. Those can all be inappropriate responses because they were appropriate within the religious framework, but they're not appropriate in the bigger world
Yeah.
framework. Yeah. Anyway,
As
so
we transition to that topic, could I ask a starting question that's been on my mind recently? For a lot of us who escape Christianity, we're most of us, at least that I've talked to, they're not doing it by and large to quote unquote sin. They're not doing it because they want more sexual freedom. They're just doing it because the worldview doesn't make sense anymore. They feel like the truth claims do not add up. But even though they might not be doing it intentionally to have more freedom, say sexually or otherwise, they suddenly, as a side effect, as a result of this worldview shift, they do feel like they've got this overwhelming freedom. And the question I had is about the idea of that the freedom having too much power over us. And I mean it in this sense. When you're a Christian, obviously the Bible and the Christian thought process has its power over you. And the shame has power over you, the community has power over you. And if you've done something, shameful in that, the fear of being exposed has power over you. And so you feel like you can't bring things into the light, even though you know that will bring to the point where they'll lose their power over you. But you end up with this secret life sometimes. But it's all these power dynamics, so much power over what you think and do and can and can't say and can't be honest about. But then when you become free, where say, for example, I'm just going to use an example. Let's say you deconvert and you realize there's nothing wrong with polyamory. There's nothing wrong with porn. It's not evil. There's no such thing as sin. But you also have this sense of like, oh my gosh, I've been deprived of so many experiences that I could have slash would have had. And it's not fair. Why did you all deprive me of this? I could have had so much, especially if you kind of made life decisions that kind of locked you in. And now it's not really an option to pursue different paths. and you kind of feel like I could have done so much. And maybe some people do end up pursuing those where, polyamory or other things are really big on their plate. But in the midst of that, and some of those decisions might be extremely healthy and extremely good for some people. I've wondered at times if that newfound aha moment of like, oh my gosh, it's all free. Like I can do it. It's not, there's no sin here. Um, is that at times overpowering where that itself can be a form of trauma where the freedom has too much power over you and you might, for example, make decisions that you later regret. And I've come across it because I think I'm in a spot where I'm thinking through it for my own life, things I want to do in life, and to say, make those decisions. Yes, you are more free than ever, but don't let anything have power over your mind or your body. Like you have the total autonomy, not a dynamic, freedom, even a freedom dynamic, as beautiful as it can be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's actually two things going on. I'm going to break it down into at least two things here. First, I'll address is pretty simple. And the description that you said, I've missed all these opportunities, that I see as a stage that many, many people go through. And it's often seen as, and people label it as the angry atheist stage. I am so pissed off because I missed out on an opportunity to go to college because of my damn religion, or I missed out on being able to explore my sexuality because of my damn religion. So that angry atheist piece is the early part of what you just asked about. And I think it's absolutely perfectly normal thing for people to experience. Problem comes when you can't get out of that. You can't move beyond that. So you're wasting all this energy on being pissed about missing opportunities rather than now taking advantage of the opportunities. I mean, I know people who have been angry atheists for 30 years. They were raised in some fundamentalist and now they're still pissed about it. Well, you can be disappointed. You can be upset that you didn't do this, but how long do you want to stay upset? And in the time, those 30 years, you could have gone back to school and actually got the degree that you were pissed about that you were not given the opportunity to do, or whatever it was that you wanted to do. So, so it's a cognitive wall that people can't seem to get through or get over or get around. And I encourage people to think about how much of your life are you wasting after religious indoctrination, and you're wasting it because you're not taking advantage of the opportunities. So that's item number one. Item number two, you call freedom, and I'm going to call it new choices. I'm not going to call it freedom. I think, although I wouldn't disagree with the term. I just think it helps to understand what are we really talking about here. We're talking about being exposed to choices you weren't prepared for. If I came out of 1900, if I was magically transported between 1900 and today, I would not be prepared for the choices that are available out here. I wouldn't have a clue what an iPhone is. I wouldn't know what a computer looks like. I would be amazed that radios can talk, that you and I can have this conversation. There's tons of choices. Now, what if I was transported from 1900 till today and just plop down here? Would I make some bad choices? Yeah, because I have no clue what I'm doing. People who are homeschooled are now, uh, who were homeschooled, are dumped from probably 1900 into the current world. And they don't know how to navigate this new world. It looks like they're making poor choices. Well, they're poor choices to a person who's been trained and educated within this structure. They're just they're just choices that people are to the homeschool person or to the person who was raised fundamentalist. They're just struggling. They're just trying to figure out, how do you navigate? How do I find a mate? How do I find a sexual partner? And they're raised in this patriarchal system where women are submissive to men. So I'm going to go out and I'm going to make what appears to be bad choices in mates or in sexual behavior because I wasn't prepared for it. So I think that the notion of bad choices implies a judgment, a morality, And I want to get away from that. I'm looking at people who are leaving religion and thinking, man, they need some education. They need some help in understanding what this choice, what the consequence of this choice will be for you down the line. If you're going to have sex, great, use a condom or birth control. But if you were told condoms are sinful, birth control is wrong, you might make a bad choice there. In my family, I have three brothers, all younger than me. I'm the oldest. We were raised in a household that had a conservative view about sexuality. Now, like I said early on, I questioned everything and I knew what condoms were for. I never, it's like, I don't know when I didn't know about condoms. It just seemed to always be there in my mind. So when it came time to start having sex, hell yeah, I'm going to use condoms, even if I'm only seven. I started having sex when I was 17 years old and never once tempted fate without a condom, right? Well, I have three brothers. They're all younger. And I was gone, and they were not the kind to ask questions. They weren't into that kind of questioning their world. And every single one of them had a baby before they were 18 years of age. One had a baby before he was 16 years of age. Just four boys in our family. So condoms weren't in their world. They weren't trained. They didn't have that advantage that I had. I don't know how I got that advantage. I just know it never occurred to them to have a condom if they're going to have sex with somebody. So but they were raised in that same religious environment, and they made what they were made a choice that had an unfortunate consequence, a consequence that they paid for the rest of their lives. In each case, that child now becomes an issue, in some case, a serious problem. So anyway, I think the reframing of that is important.
Yeah.
I want people to realize that Christian training is so shame and guilt based. Now, Christian training, in my book, The God Virus, I talk about the difference between shame and guilt. And Christianity is more a guilt based religion. Islam is more shame based religion. Hinduism, more shame based religion. Jehovah's Witnesses are more shame based religion. So you've got the beauty of the Christian Protestant religion is that it learned the power of guilt. Guilt means you have thought police in your head no matter where you are. You don't have to have a priest watching over you or an imam or anything like that. Guilt-based religions are controlling whether you've got a religious supervisor or not because it's in your, so thought police are always in your head. Shame religions are much more communal in that sense. You don't have to have you're within a community, and if you violate the laws of that community, those norms of the religion of that community, you can get your head chopped off. Women are incredibly shamed for their sexuality in Islam, even more. But that's a shame-based. You are bad, not that you did a bad thing, but you are bad. That's shame. I've got a whole theory about why Christianity became more guilt-based. We have shame too. Don't get me wrong. There's every religion is a common. I see shame and guilt on a kind of a spectrum, with shame having more of a community aspect to it, whereas guilt having more of just a basic psychological aspect to it. But both are effective in keeping you religious, keeping you within whatever the religion was that brainwashed you, or not. I don't hate that term. Sorry, that indoctrinated you originally.
I'd love to hear your
All right.
conjecture about why Christianity went down the route of a guilt-based perspective more. It's a good topic. I don't think I've heard you speak on this one before.
Yeah, well, it's just my theory. I don't have a ton of evidence. I think there's a lot. As societies atomize, as societies fall apart, um, there's less and less communal supervision. So in Europe, as the 30 Years' War is starting as a result of the Lutheran Reformation, so you got Martin Luther, and the notion of religion as a virus that spreads from my brain to your brain. Lutheranism spread throughout Northern Europe like a wildfire. It was amazing how quickly it spread. You know church history, you know what I'm talking about. So highly successful viruses can spread across the entire planet in record time, as we just saw in 2020. The COVID virus spread across this entire planet. Religion do the same thing. They spread extremely fast when they have the right key. And it doesn't happen very often, but when a religion finds just the right balance of whatever it is, it could start infecting brain to brain to brain to brain to brain. Before you know it, you got millions of brains buying into this stuff. And that's what Lutheranism did. But what happened as a result of Lutheranism is this notion that you don't have to follow the church's guidance, you follow your own guidance. You read your own Bible and come to your own conclusions. So that breaks the chain of community. The community is not there to supervise your adherence to religious ideology. Whereas in Catholicism, for 1,500 years, until Luther came along, Catholicism had built a bulwark over about 1,100 years, built a bulwark of community supervision. That breaks down when Lutheranism comes along, and now you're accountable to God directly. There is no priest between you and God, and that breakdown means that it's harder to keep control of you. And so whatever religion it is, it's got to find another way to keep you infected with that particular God virus. And Lutheranism sees guilt, because you can carry guilt with you no matter where you go. You're always, but once you escape a shame-based community, once a Muslim, and Islam is very shame-based, once a person leaves Iran and moves to Toronto, Canada as a Muslim, they are suddenly confronted with all sorts of options and choices they wouldn't have had. And so their brain can expand dramatically and learn new things and do new things. And there's no shame anymore. You're not going to get your head chopped off if you don't wear a hijab. So you've got a whole new framework. And if you don't have guilt, you're going to lose that religion entirely. The shame-based religions really, really have to have community in order to survive. And that's why as soon as a Muslim leaves Islam and goes to Malmo, Sweden, and gets sucked right back into the Islamic community in Malmo, Sweden, where that you literally can still get your head chopped off for not wearing hijab in some areas of that community, it goes right back into the shame-based structure. As Protestant moves out of that phase, and remember, during that time, 30 Years' War, 23 million people lost their lives. Talk about, it was an incredible slaughter. And percentage-wise, more people died in the 30 Years' War than died in World War I. So it was among the bloodiest wars in world history. Probably second or third only to World War II and the Mongol wars. Those were obviously more devastating. But as we move out of that phase, then a whole new way of being religious starts happening, because religion becomes atomized. You've got Quakers, you got Mennonites, you got Baptists, you got Anabaptists, you got all these subgroups starting to, Calvinists pop up, and they're each trying to create their own communities, but they're going to be imperfect because those communities are tiny compared to the gigantic Catholic communities that existed before. And so this atomization means that guilt becomes more and more important in the training of children. And of course, you get to the United States, you get to the Midwest, where there's one church in the whole town. It may not be the church that you grew up in. Then there's a whole new way of being religious in the Midwest. And if you want to understand that, there's an interesting book written many years ago called The People Called Quakers by D. Elton Trueblood. It's just a history of the Quaker Church. But it's the history of the Quaker Church as it moves from the East Coast to the West Coast. And what happens to that church as it goes through the frontier? And that's why you've got Quakers in Philadelphia that are silent meeting Quakers, and you got Quakers in California that look more like evangelical Christians, and yet they both say they're Quaker. Well, you see the same thing happen to many other churches. It's just one case study of many. Well, anyway, I did not realize we were going down that rabbit hole, Tim.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think your observations are very astute, because you do end up in a spot where, in this religious culture of Christianity, you can be very far from your community and still just feel overwhelming guilt. And it's like the you mentioned the thought police, the whole North Korea, but there's ways in which we were in North Korea, as it were, metaphorically speaking, and we leave, but that's still in our blood. It's in our blood. It's just and especially when you really do you just get completely trained on the idea that you're a bad person and you deserve,
Right.
it isn't just the general things. It's like the biggest focus of your life has been, why did Christ have to get tortured? Why, it wasn't just that he died. He had to die a violent death with blood for you. Why? Because you're that bad.
Yeah,
And
right.
you get that in somebody's head from the earliest days. You're that bad. You're like, yeah. And every time, I don't know if you hear this much, but I remember hearing a lot, like every time you sin, it's as if you are taking another nail and, popping it into Jesus's arms or feet or cutting his side. And I remember it's funny now, it's pretty serious stuff, but I remember people even talking about every time you masturbate, like that's a sin that God died for. You're literally, while you're jerking off, you are putting Jesus back on the cross. And you get that in somebody's head, like where it's not a joke, it's very serious business. Yeah, that's
Mm-hmm.
you can't get that back out. You do feel guilty all the
So
time.
I think we could say with a reasonable degree of certainty that that is a trauma response.
Yeah.
You are now hating your own body. You're hating normal human behavior. How is that not a trauma response for most people? And now you can't have good sexual relations with yourself, and can't have good sexual relations with another human being because your trauma gets in the way. And I like to say, if you are a Christian, believes in Jesus, and you're married and you're having sex, you're having a threesome with Jesus because he's watching everything you're doing, right? And there's certain ways of having sex that you should and shouldn't do, even if you're married. And purity culture just fucks that all up big time because it says you can't have sex before you get married. And when you do get married, there's only certain ways you can have sex. And I know so many people who could not properly consummate their own marriage because of purity culture, maybe for 3 or 4 years before
Hmm.
they could actually have sex. And they never relaxed. They oftentimes had to get out of the religion before they could just relax and enjoy their own body or
That's so
someone
sad.
else's body.
Hmm.
Yep.
Well, on that note of sexuality, one topic that comes up a lot, and I'd love to transition to it for a while now, if we could, is the topic of pornography. And I know even the word pornography is loaded because it's from Greek words that we've always been taught. It means porneos means sex sins, but uh, broadening it away from that term and just saying the idea of things such as seeing other people, unclothed or having sex, having a fantasy life where you're imagining something. We're kind of hyper trained to think that is bad. But in addition, even when you deconvert and you say, no, that's not sin because sin is not a thing, there's a lot of cultural pressures to say a couple things. Number one, if you're married, especially, or in a committed relationship, if you're having sex with your partner, then why would you need to ever think of porn? Because all of your sexual energy should be focused on your partner. And if you're not, in a relationship, if you're using porn, then you're setting yourself up for failure because you're imagining somebody that's, all in your mind is, they're always up for it. They're always in great shape. And then when you finally find this real person who's got flaws and foibles and wrinkles, and they're sometimes tired or sick, and they're not always up for it, you're going to be so disappointed because they're not like your porn star image. And in addition, of course, there's the technical issues of, like, some pornography is very much created in a context which we would want to stop, where they're actually exploiting people. But when you look at all these issues and put them all together, people end up in a spot where they're either still looking at porn but feeling very guilty about it, or they're at least thinking pornographically. They're thinking these things, fantasy life kind of stuff, but thinking that this is bad. And you're the other last dynamic I was going to weave in is you get a lot of messages from, especially from my experience, a lot of messages from women saying that men who do it are basically, creeps or jerks, or basically they're the problem of why a marriage can't be good is because a guy is thinking pornographically. I've seen that both on the Christian side and even in the atheist community. How when guys end up, I think, especially feeling, and I'm obviously speaking from a guy's perspective, but I'm sure some ladies would probably agree with this, but so many of us feel set up to fail. Like there's no way to win this without somebody saying you're a bad person. So if you could, any of those, take it whatever direction you want, but how do you see the topic of pornography, and how do you help people just to figure out how to enjoy what they want to enjoy without, the guilt that's so prevalent?
Okay, so we're on for another 3 hours. Is that what we're doing here today?
Exactly. It's a loaded question, I know. Take it any direction you want.
I will. I'm going to start off by some shameless promotion because that's why I wrote this book. Go read my book, Sex and God. And the subtitle is important: How Religion Distorts Sexuality. Everything you just described is a distortion of human sexuality, period. No, full stop. And let me go back to a little bit earlier in our history. And let's look at the bonobos, or let's look at the chimps. When somebody is having sex in a chimp or a bonobo community, everybody watches. I mean, if the male and the female, dominant male and some females are having sex, people will sit there and watch. And now to me, pornography is, generally speaking, watching somebody else doing something sexual on a video. Well, they don't need videos in the chimp community because they got sex going on all the time. They can just watch they can watch anybody having sex in that community. Is that immoral? Bonobos have sex all the fucking time. They're a very, very sexual, open, female dominated sexuality kind of species. So that starts us off here. As a biological being, we like watching, period. And it goes back to chimps. Think about this. What were people doing a million years ago if they were living in a village and somebody wanted to have sex and you were sitting in a hut that housed 15 people at night? You don't think somebody was having sex while everybody else knew it? Hell yeah. This whole notion of sexual privacy is a fairly modern idea because people were living communally in large log or structures. The Iroquois, 60, 70 people in the Iroquois tribe in, say, Illinois or in Ohio, were living in these longhouses. Where are they having sex? They're having sex right there in their bed. Nobody has privacy. So this notion of sex and privacy is somewhat unique to humans. Now, I'm not saying that chimps don't sneak off into the forest or the grass to have sex without anybody seeing that. It's not like they're putting on a show. So anyway, just look at how other animals do sex. Would your dog have sex in front of you? Do you think they worry about it? Of course they don't. So when you look at it from that perspective, loosen up a little bit. We're a species just like anybody else. Now, I'm going to address a whole bunch of things here. And I'm not even going to talk about porn to begin with. We'll get there. But I want to talk about who humans are, what humans are, how our hormones work. We're born with hormones flowing through our system, from the very beginning. And the hormones rise and fall according to what our brains and our bodies are doing at that time. So you're going to get androgens like testosterone rising and falling throughout your life, beginning at very early on in your, as the fetus is developing. There will be a rise for males and for females to some degree. There will be a rise in testosterone and there will be a decline. And this during the time that you're in utero. And then as you get into childhood, you're going to have those hormones go up and then back down again. And they'll stay down until puberty, and then they start coming back up again. So you get this up and down, rise and fall. And I'm not just talking testosterone. There's 100 other hormones that are all doing their thing to try and help the body complete the task that is important for the body at that point in time. So you don't have pubic hair when you're 5 years old, but you may start getting pubic hair when you're 10, 11, 12, because that's when those hormones start coming in for both male and female. So hormones are going up and down as a developmental part of who we are. And they go up way high in about 14 or 15 or 16. So that's when religion says and tries to preach to you that you can't have sex. And that's the time when you're probably the horniest in your entire life. That's probably where you're having the most driven by the hormones. Because as a species, we were generally mating at 16, 17, maybe even earlier. I mean, Jesus was born of a virgin who was probably 12 years old. Mary may have been 12 years old. That was not uncommon back then. It may have even been the rule. If you look at other hunter-gatherer societies, when do women become women in many cultures? There's one culture called the Na culture in China, where when the woman has her first menstrual cycle, she goes from being a child to being a woman. There's no adolescence in that culture. There are a number of cultures where there is no adolescence. You go from being a child to an adult overnight based upon that alone. And then you can start in that culture, the girl can invite any man she wants into her room. And she can have multiple partners for the rest of her life, because in the Na culture, there is no such thing as marriage. If you ask the woman who's the father of this child, she'd laugh. We don't have that concept. We don't have the concept of marriage. We don't have the concept of fatherhood. The men who are the mentors for my if I'm a woman in the Na culture, my uncles are the male figures for my children. So it's a very different kind of sexuality. If you look at the sexuality of 26 different cultures in the middle of the Amazonian forest, you'll find a concept called partible paternity. If you're a primitive scientist in the Amazonian forest, you would look at how the pecaries mate, and you'll realize, or the dogs mate, you'll realize that a female peccary may have sex with a half a dozen males before she has a litter of baby peccaries. And you might come to the conclusion that it takes many male peccaries to have healthy babies. And you might think, well, okay, then if I'm a female, I need to make sure I have healthy babies. So I need to have sex with at least 2 or 3 or 4 men to have a baby, and my baby will be healthy. If I only have sex with one man, my baby may be sickly and die. And that is their belief. As a culture, they have what's called partible paternity. They believe that each man adds his energy by having sex with the woman, and she chooses which women she wants to have sex with. So she might have sex with 3 women. She's going to have one baby, but that one baby will have a part of each of those men. So now you've got the beautiful benefit of having 3 men interested in the health of that baby and bringing her food and meat, and so she has support for that in that environment, if you will. So what I'm trying to do is introduce your viewers to the notion that there's a wide range of sexualities. Christian sexuality is actually an aberration. It's a weird way of being sexual. I mean, really weird. Just because something is the majority doesn't mean it's right. Most people thought the earth was flat for thousands of years. That doesn't mean it's right. What we've got here is an ideology that is spread throughout much of the planet. And by this, I'm including Islam, because Islam adopted a whole lot of ideas about what kinds of sexuality, right and wrong, good and bad. So let's just add Islam to this spread of an ideology around sexuality and realize that these folks, if you're a Christian, you are practicing a really strange approach to human sexuality. Look broader. That's why I wrote so much anthropology in my book, Sex and God. So I want people to realize there's so many ways of being sexual. You could be sexual like the Manganians are. You could be sexual like the Hawaiians were. You could be sexual like the Central African tribes were before Western contact. Or the New Guinean Highlanders or the Na culture. There are thousands of cultures, some of which are extinct now, that had a very different sexuality. If you look at the Iroquois and the so-called five civilized tribes, they were matriarchal, and and it kind of a side note here. They had a confederacy, they had a presidency, if you will. It just goes back to the days of what we call Hiawatha now. Females, uh, females could not hold office in the Iroquois Confederacy, but only females could vote. So you have female voting, males, so the males had to campaign to get the females to vote for them, so to speak. That's a whole different political system that looks really weird, but there's lots of weirdness out there. There's not one way to be political. There's not one way to be sexual. And sometimes those two things intermingle, of course. So now let's get to the biology at a more hormonal level. One wag once said the greatest suppressor of testosterone is marriage. And we've got real evidence that when men get married, not long after that, their testosterone starts going down. And it stays down for about 4 years. And after 4 years, it starts coming back up again. What's the year where there's the highest divorce rate? Somewhere around 4, 5, 6 years. That's where this first big leap in divorce happens. Helen Fisher wrote a book, I've got it right on my bookshelf back here, on this very thing. And she's an anthropologist. What she discovered was across cultures, no matter where you go, the rate at which relationships split up is about 4 or 5 years. Well, what's going on there? It's the hormones. We have something. If I said take your hand and just rub it really hard and keep rubbing it, pretty soon you won't even be able to feel the rub. The nerves become overstimulated, and when it becomes overstimulated, they stop responding. It's called satiation. That's the psychological satiation. So I just satiated those nerve endings. Well, if I have sex with the same person, let's go back a second. If I told you love steak, Tim, and so from now on, you get to have steak for every single meal, and you can't have anything else for the rest of your life, you would say I was crazy. And about a week into this experiment, you'd stop wanting to have steak. You'd be sick of steak. You may not want to see steak again. I have been in that situation where I had to eat the same kind of food for long periods of time, and I got sick of it. I don't want it again the rest of my life. So people get satiated, and they get satiated of each other. It's a normal thing for a married couple after about 4 or 5 years to get tired of each other sexually. So if we can start admitting to ourselves that this notion of lifelong marriage and lifelong pair bonding is the norm, we can get rid of that and start being realistic about who we are as animals. Then we can start being more realistic about what kind of relationships we want. Don't get me wrong, I don't care if you want to be married for 50 years. If you want to be, that's fine. Go for it. No skin off my nose. I don't want that, but you may want to. That's good. I had both of my grandparents were married for over 50 years. We were able to celebrate their 50th wedding anniversary for both sides of my family. That's 4 different people that I know were married for over 50 years. And that's also 4 people that were among the most miserable human beings I ever knew. They couldn't stand each other. They had obviously not had sex in many, many years. And they had incredible bitterness inside of themselves about their relationship. But they were so proud that they had 50 years of not happy marriage, just fucking marriage. Now, where's the honor in being married for 50 years? It's a cultural construct. It has nothing to do with our biology. Now, does that mean that you should get divorced after 4 years that you won't have sex. No, it doesn't mean that at all. There's other ways to invent our sexuality. And one of the more important ways I would submit is pornography. How do I keep my sexual interest up if I'm no longer interested in my particular partner? I love my partner. I'm pair bonded with my partner. I don't want to split up with my partner, and she doesn't want to split up with me, for example. So what can I do? I can keep my sexual interest up by watching pornography or by using some kind of sexual stimulus, play and toys, using toys, for example, vibrators, spanking, whatever you're into, you can rejuvenate a sexual relationship through these practices, and you can maintain this over a very long period of time. If you want to have a different lifestyle, you can say, well, let's become swingers. I've known many a married couple that decided after 10 years of marriage they wanted to try swinging. Okay, go for it. And a surprisingly number of cases that I'm personally familiar with, it worked. They stayed married. They stayed married for a long time after that. I was married in my own life. I was married for 18 years. I do not consider that a quote failed marriage. I hear that term failed marriage. I think that's bullshit. It was a successful marriage. I had two great kids out of it. I just didn't follow the rules of the culture or of Christianity in that. I maintain a very close and good relationship with my children, helped get them raised, still friends with my spouse, my ex-spouse. What's wrong with this picture? Am I at 20 years old when I decided to get married? Do I have a chain now, a physical chain that chains me to this other person? That's kind of crazy to think. Okay, from now on, you've got a physical chain that lets you get no more than 15 feet apart from each other. If I told you that's your fate for the rest of your life, you would clearly think that's abusive. Well, it is abusive to force people into something they don't want to be in. And that's what Christianity does. It forces us into a really weird, abnormal relationship framework that almost no other species does. Now, there's another issue here. Oxytocin, vasopressin, these are hormones that are coursing through our blood and making us do different things. Oxytocin is one. Vasopressin, the male version of oxytocin, generally speaking, helps us have a relationship, helps us bond to each other. And we've got evidence that pair bonding in animals like the prairie voles happens as a direct result of those hormones, mainly vasopressin and oxytocin. So what happens when you block the oxytocin? What happens when you block the vasopressin? You have a person take a blocker that blocks those hormones. Well, the bonding goes down. That reduces the ability to bond in those species. Well, nobody does that experiment on a human, but if it works on prairie voles, then maybe we should think about how is it working on us. I think people can have lifelong relationships that are successful and that are even sexual if they just admit who are we? We're an animal that can get satiated with a sex partner over a course of 4 or 5 years. What do we want to do with that? Well, I bought a house with my partner. I've had 2 children with my partner. I've got in-laws I really love and care for, or whatever. There's all this bonds that have happened. I don't want to break that up if I can avoid it. So is there a way for us to rejuvenate our marriage? Is there a way for us to open our marriage up? Maybe be polyamorous, maybe we just be swingers. But at the very least is let's use pornography to keep our sexual lives alive. I can have sex with my favorite porn star whenever I want, but I still love my spouse. And as I'm having sex with my spouse, I can think about my porn star. And there's nothing wrong with that. People have sex with all sorts of people while they're having sex with their partner.
I love what you're saying.
The thought police won't let you do that. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to go down that route. Exactly. I can hear people's thoughts. I don't know if there are objections, but I can hear people's gut reactions to some of this because I'm sure I've got it too. Of Number one, the thought of if you're not solely focused on your spouse, that sense like the Bible talks about, or Jesus talks about in the Bible, if you've even looked at a woman to lust after her, you've committed adultery. And I think for us, the idea of even the verbiage of lust and adultery is so woven into our self-talk that it's hard for us not to look at these things and feel, again, going back to where we started, feel guilty, feeling guilty that
Wow.
this is stuff that's off limits, and it may be unhealthy, toxic, whatever. And I do wonder though if there are some differences between men and women, because as I hear women talk about these in different YouTube videos I might watch of people talking about why pornography is not a good idea. The sense that I think some people feel like uh, they're being treated as if they're not exclusive anymore. And I think we're so used, like you said, pair bonding, but that sense of like, I want someone's eyes to be only on me. I want that exclusivity. And I think because we're so used to that and trained to it, it's so weird. It's not even like we don't want to use the word evil or sinful because we know that stuff's not real, but it's just so other. It's so different that we can't wrap our minds around that the world you're describing could actually be quite healthy and even completely healthy. And I think for those of us like for myself, my whole world was geared toward exclusivity. Even the Bible talks about being a one woman man, where you get married, you're focused on her, and she's your world. And I do wonder how we get past that background of being a one woman man and whatever, being exclusive, to opening it up and not and being able to say that doesn't imply that you don't love the person you're with, and it doesn't imply that you're adulterous. But it's just woven into it's like a if then, like if you go down that route, then you're an adulterer. If you go down the lust route, then you are a bad guy. How do you help people to start to get past some of those significant hiccups to having such an openness?
Well, first of all, I would say everything you described is actually a trauma response.
Yeah, I'm sure.
If you go back to our definition, a response is inappropriate response to the environment. Men and women both have been programmed in the very ideas you just talked about. Now, as I described earlier, the culture of the Nas in China, where it's a female-dominated sexuality. When the girl has a period, she becomes a woman. She can invite men in and have sex with them. She doesn't know there's no marriage. Ask them what they think of us Westerners who think we can be married for 50 years. They'll look at you like you got three heads. It's weird. It is a really weird idea that you have to be married to a man. The notion of marrying a man isn't even in their culture. It doesn't compute up here in their brains. If I went to the Hadza culture in Africa, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer cultures, because they have such a unique situation, and they still carry on just as they did in many ways 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. In that environment, the woman, what we would say, shacks up with a man, but it's in the woman's hut. It's not the man's hut; it's the woman's hut. Women own the resources in many cases. So the man shacks up with a woman for 3 or 4 or 5 years. She has a baby with that man. She gets the baby up to 4 or 5 years old. When the baby can now participate in hunting and gathering, you don't have to carry in your arms anymore at 5 years old. And about that time, she gets tired of him. She kicks him out, and she looks for another man. In the course of the reproductive life of the woman, she may have three, four, or five husbands in the sense of having somebody that's living with them. Does that compute for you? No, because you were not raised with that sexuality. What you've just demonstrated to me is your deeply embedded indoctrination with a certain religious sexuality. I call it Christian sexuality, but it's not Islamic sexuality, because in Islam, I could have up to four wives. Does that compute with you? And let's think about this. The people in the New Testament, I'm sorry, that were writing that shit, who even Paul was gay. I mean, I'm just thinking Jesus was gay. Somebody walking around in a desert with 12 guys following him. Does that sound like a heterosexual guy to you? No. And they're telling you what to do with your life. Okay. So there's lots of crazy ideas. And one of the craziest ideas is the notion of celibacy that, of course, comes out of Paul, better to marry than to burn kind of notion. But think about this. What is the most perverted sexual thing you can do? And I'm not asking you to respond to that. Just put it in your mind. Now, I'm going to tell you what it is. The most perverted sexual thing you can do is be celibate for your whole life, as nuns and priests are. That is fucking perverted because it is so unnatural. It goes against everything our bodies and our hormones want to do. So we're talking some pretty weird shit here if you think about it. Catholic priests and nuns are telling us how we can do sexuality, and they're engaging in the most perverted sexuality there is. Now, what's the second most perverted sexuality is probably abusing and raping young children, which priests and nuns seem to do a lot of throughout history. And I'm not talking just Spotlight, that movie Spotlight, or the recent so-called recent scandals of those scandals have been going back thousands of years, or at least 1,000 years in the Catholic Church. Just nobody around to point it out. The church had the power. And look what's happening in the Baptist churches. Look what's happening in the Jehovah's Witnesses, the sex scandals. What is going on here? Why is there so much inappropriate sexual behavior going on among Catholic priests, among Baptist ministers, among Pentecostal ministers? You name the religion, Buddhism. There's huge scandal in Taiwan a few years ago because Buddhists, it turns out somebody wanted to point out that Buddhist monks were raping Buddhist boys in the monastery on a regular basis. That's because they have a tradition there. It's been thousands of years old that 9-year-old boys are now dedicated to the temple. They're taken from their parents, put in these temples, and the Buddhist monks are supposed to train them up to be good Buddhist monks as they grow up. Well, what are they doing in that time? They're raping the 9-year-old boys. That's, quote, normal for them until somebody pointed out probably isn't a good idea. There's so much to unpack here. And what I'm encouraging you and your listeners to do is start unpacking. Because once you get it unpacked, and it takes years to unpack some of this shit, and you may never get it all unpacked. I'm not saying you will. Then you can start creating your own sexuality. Say, what kind of a sexual being do I want to be during my lifetime? I've only got one life. So let me create my sexuality. And what are the principles? My sexuality is always be respectful of the other person, always have enthusiastic consent. I don't want to be in bed with somebody that's not enthusiastic about being in bed with me. And take care of myself. My sexuality is not my sexual satisfaction is not the responsibility of anybody else. So if I have a hard time having an orgasm, that's my problem, not my partner's problem. Now, she or he may want to help me, may want to help me work on it, but it's ultimately my responsibility to have my own orgasm. I'll give you an example of this. I had a Catholic couple come into me. It's been years ago, and the complaint was she couldn't have orgasms. And they'd been married for years and she'd never had orgasms. She seemed to like sex, seemed to do well with it. Well, what happened was I asked her one simple question. Well, how do you give yourself an orgasm? And she looks at me like a deer in the headlights. She gets white as a sheet. Takes her forever to answer the question. And she said, I could never touch myself. God wouldn't approve of that.
Oh, wow.
I don't remember those are her words, but anyway, that was basically the gist of it. So we had to work for a few weeks on helping her get over the idea of touching herself, giving herself an orgasm. I told her, look, you can't expect your husband to give yourself an orgasm if you can't give one for yourself. You know your body, he doesn't. About 4 weeks into our work together, she comes in one day with her husband, big, gigantic smiles on their face, We did it. We did it. I had an orgasm. First orgasm she'd had in her entire life. And it was because she learned how to masturbate. And then she taught him how to give her an orgasm.
Hmm.
Well, she had to unpack that Catholic bullshit. And she wasn't even, as far as I know, they weren't super religious or super Catholic, but they had definitely been deeply infected with all this. I don't know. Have we answered your question a little bit? I've got
Yeah,
some
no,
more to talk about here, but I'll
that's
stop.
that's good. I would just say I think one of the hardest parts about this, and feel free to respond, is when you do have one person in a marriage where there is the hope and expectation of it being a long-term relationship, possibly until death do us part, but one person is much more open and the other person is not. And especially when the person that is not open is categorizing the person that is open as being bad, whether it's for religious reasons or just even if they're not religious, just saying you're introducing topics and ideas and possibilities that are going to unwind the commitment level that we've had all these years. It's so hard, and I think I struggle for the people that struggle in silence, that hurt in silence, thinking I need more, I need different, I at least need to talk about it. And the idea of being open is just not an option. Like I know, even stepping away from this particular topic, but just the topic of sexuality in general is so hard for so many of us to be open about what we want. And I'll just share the story real quick. I remember when I was in Bible college, the dean of men brought us to all the guys to the dining room one time, this big dining hall, and I was thinking, this guy's only invited all of us once this whole year, and I'm thinking it's going to be something like, guys, you need to be on fire for the Lord, share the gospel with everybody you can, all these things, be on fire for the Lord. Let's really be holy people so God can use us. Whatever. Are you worshiping enough? And this is one message you can guess was guys stop masturbating. And I don't know that he had a particular story in mind that prompted that, or if he just assumed that's what was going on because that was his background. But it's this sense of like, this is really a big deal to not be open to what you need. And I think a lot of us, and even as atheists, perhaps we end up with these double lives where you have this facade of I am perfectly fine with normal, um, with just a normal, whatever, bare bones. Everything is basically this simple missionary position marriage, as it were, and yet the one or the other person is saying, I want so much more. And yet that fear factor, like if I, not if I do it, but if I just open up that I want more, I know they're going to think immediately, like, why are you destroying our marriage? And my heart breaks for people who just, it's not just they can't do it, they can't even be honest about it.
That's very deep. Again, I think it's a trauma response. Now, it doesn't feel like it because we think of trauma as something other people have or very few people have. I'm here to tell you, if you're raised in purity culture, you've been traumatized.
Yeah.
And your inability to have a normal, natural, smooth, easy flowing sexual relationship with another human being is because of that trauma. It's that simple.
Hmm. Is it,
So go ahead.
can I say, is it toxic to fantasize about other people, in your opinion?
What would
If
well?
two
Let's begin
people
with the,
if two people are in a marriage where they're saying, I want to be with you and only you forever. If someone says, I think about a threesome from time to time, is that introducing a is there are there some people for whom that would be a topic that would be better left to the privacy of your own mind, and to say, if you go down that route, you're literally destroying our marriage? Like, how do you approach someone that wants more but knows that it's just going to end up in flames?
sounds to me like you may be with the wrong person.
Yeah.
If you're, have you, let's go to a whole nother subject. What if you were married to somebody who hates traveling, but you love to travel?
Hmm.
And so you end up staying at home your whole life because they don't want to travel. Is that a good idea?
No.
I'm fantasizing about going to Europe. I want to go see Australia. No, I'm not traveling. I'm not going outside of this city. So would it be inappropriate for me to get on an airplane and go to Australia? without my partner? I'm just asking, is that inappropriate?
It might be up at the very beginning, but if you've given enough warning and set a safe context for, hey, I'm eventually going to do this, come, please come with me or don't. I would think it eventually, if you've been very open and honest and given them time to think it through, and they're still
Okay.
closed-minded, eventually it's time to say, no, I'm doing this.
So what's the difference between that and sex? We as human beings love variety. I'm not saying everybody loves it equally or in the same ways, but the person who stays home every day and never wants to travel likes to find different recipes to cook and explore food. Well, that's another form of variety. But you only want hamburgers every day. I'm not eating any of this shit you're bringing home or the stuff you're cooking. You like this weird spaghetti stuff. I don't want that. Is that right of you to impose that on her or him, depending? No, we want variety. And if you can't admit that I'm a human being and I like variety, now let's figure out what kind of variety works to maintain this relationship. If variety means we become swingers, fine. If variety means I look at porn and you look at porn, or we look at independently at whatever porn we want to do, I don't care, then that's the way we fulfill our need for variety.
Yeah.
It would be crazy to think humans can live without variety. That's the worst thing you can do to a human being is lock them down. I mean, think about North Korea. There ain't no variety there. And yet we look at that and think that's horrible, the way people are treated, the way they bind their minds into chains, basically. Or look at the Soviet Union. There's or look at homeschooled children in America. They're all the same.
Yeah.
Those humans need variety. Now, I'm not here to do therapy, but I will say that two people, there's a concept that we don't talk about too often, but sex therapists do, and that is desire differences. You can have very different levels of desire in a relationship. One person always horny, the other person never horny. And what we often see is that relationships start off hot and bothered. Everybody's hot and bothered. Everybody wants to have sex all the time. And then slowly but surely, the sex starts going down. That is a normal progression. However, after about 4 or 5 years, testosterone in males oftentimes starts going back up, but it doesn't go back up in the female. So now you've got a differential in desire. You've got a male that's back to wanting sex every day like they were when they're married, and a female that says, no, that we went through that phase. I don't want that anymore. And so you get this differential. And then religion comes along and starts using its crazy ideas about what you should and shouldn't be, and gives the tools to one or the other partner, because this can go the other way. Some women go back to being horny as hell after about 4 or 5 years, and the man's drops. So you get this differential, and that's normal. So what if we could admit to ourselves that having different desire levels is okay? It's the way humans are made. Now, what do we want to do about it as a couple? Let's negotiate or renegotiate. What I found is when you sign the wedding agreement at young age, usually, you're way too young to. I got married at 20. What the hell did I know at 20? I did not realize that my sexuality hadn't even started yet. But once I understood what I could do after I got divorced at 18 years of marriage, I realized, boy, there's a whole world of sexuality out here. Now, what do I want to do with it? And do I ever want to get into a relationship again with another person who isn't as open-minded as I am? Why would I want to subject myself to the chains of another person's religious ideology? Sometimes you do. I'm okay with it if you want to. I've seen people marry Muslim. I've seen Christian raised women marry Muslim men, and then suddenly find themselves in the chains and the prison of Islamic sexuality. Even though she hasn't converted, she's still a non-Muslim. That's what he expects. He's going to impose that. If that's what your choice is, you're free to make that choice. I would never make that because I don't want to be chained down.
Yeah.
And
If I could I make a quick comment? I think, and this, I'd love to still want your feedback on this, but I think one of the things that I personally feel like I struggle with this is bring it to poetry. That's a good place to start. When I write poetry a lot, I sing a lot of my poetry, and it's basically daydreams about a marriage, a love life that's real and vibrant. And often my poetry will include words about like loving someone to the very end. Till death do us part can be that romantic side, and yet I want, it's like you want both. Like I want that till death do us part. I want that beautiful commitment. I want to be enough, and I want someone else to feel like they're more than enough for me. And I think I see a beauty in being with just one person, just myself. And yet, even though I personally see a beauty in that, and I think I'm geared to that, I see that other side of it that you're saying, like the variety is important, and stagnation is so easy to fall into, to get into that rut. And especially if one person again is a differential where you like, I'm really committed to you and I want to be more than enough, and you're more than enough for me, but all of a sudden you don't want to be touched anymore. There's those issues, but there's that dreaminess that maybe that's part of the Christian worldview, but that the romanticism of I want to be enough for you, and I don't want you to ever feel the sense that I've rejected you. I want you to feel utterly just like you're my all in all. And yet you want to be really sexually playful. And I think that's where I struggle with this whole thing is I want more. I want exponentially more. I want the fantasy world in my mind. I want the pleasure. I want the eroticism. I want I want everything. And yet I fear that some people that I could see as a potential partner someday would say, I love the romantic side of that. I love the commitment side of that. But the playfulness ends up sounding like you're weaving in messages of, I'm not actually enough for you, or you're rejecting me in some way. And I don't know. I struggle with it. I'm not saying it's the right way to see it, but I struggle with both sides of this because I want both worlds. I want the romantic commitment. I want the playful fantasy. I want the pornographic mindset. I really want the pornographic mindset because I think in some ways it ends up bringing you to be human in a way you've never been before, perhaps as a Christian. And yet the long-term commitment saying, I can see us, in rocking chairs in our 80s together, holding hands, having been together, hopefully not like you said with your grandparents where you're antagonistic or not happy, but where you're just saying, what a beautiful life it's been, and we've done it together. And I don't know, does that make sense, that antagonism in my own heart?
it makes a lot of sense. And let me frame it this way. Every human being on the planet struggles with two main things: variety and security. Variety and security. And we all have different mixes of that. I like tons and tons of variety. If I find somebody that's open to all the variety, then I can gain a relationship that has security. If I'm going to be in partner with somebody who is not open to variety, then I'm not going to be secure with them and they're not going to be secure with me. I've never cheated on. If I made a commitment to and I'm hetero, so if I made a commitment to a woman in my life, I never violated that. I never cheated on anybody I'd made a commitment to. Doesn't mean I was happy. Doesn't mean I was satisfied. And that's why after I got divorced from my second wife, I realized this ain't working. I'm not a monogamous person. I want too much variety. So I have to find a partner that's okay with that variety or will participate in that variety. She doesn't have to participate. She doesn't want to. So in the course of I've been polyamorous now since 2001. I found my level of balance between variety and security. Now, here's another issue. As I heard you say, we're together, 80 years old, holding hands. The hormones that are going through your blood at 80 are really different than the hormones that are going through your blood at 40. I'll tell you that from experience. I could fuck for hours at 40. I could go on for days at 40. I ain't working like that now. I've got just as much interest in sex and my sexuality, but the energy level is simply not there. That's pretty damn normal for a 73-year-old guy. I would say that at every each of us humans is going through our own journey and our hormonal journey. Our hormones are changing. I'm sure there's less testosterone in my blood now than there was at 40. I'm positive of that. And yet my brain still says, "Ooh, this is interesting," but my body doesn't respond the same way. Thank the flying spaghetti monster for Viagra. It's a great help aid. Let's just put it that way. I love it. Or Levitra or whatever else you want to see, Alice. Take your pick. But you have to negotiate, and this is your responsibility on this planet. You have to negotiate your own journey, and then you have to figure a way to negotiate that with another human being on that journey, if that's what you want. It is not as simple as signing a marriage certificate. And it is not I hear people say, we've got to have better communication. Bullshit. Part of it is communication, but a lot more of it is acknowledging who we are at this stage in our life cycle. That is why I'll go back to something that kind of sounds disjointed, but I'm going to come back to this. If you've ever watched many of my talks, especially my talks on sexuality, you will see me get up in front of 500 people, and there are videos out there, or 1,300 people in one case. And the first thing that comes out of my mouth as I'm getting ready to talk is I say, "I masturbate. How many of you masturbate? Raise your hand." There's a reason, a very important reason why I start my entire talk with that question. That's because you are the first sex partner you'll ever have, and you may be the last sex partner you ever have. Get fucking used to you as a sex partner. Once you've done that, you have a lot more tools and power to negotiate with whomever you want to have a partnership with. And whether you want to call it marriage or not, I don't care. But you have to be comfortable in your own sexuality and body before you can really effectively negotiate with another person. Now, what if this other person is not like that Catholic woman I told you about? What if that person is not comfortable in their sexuality? What if they can't even touch themselves? What if they think female masturbation is a sin against God? If you've got all this going on over here, ain't no way you're going to be able to negotiate. No matter how in touch you are with your own sexuality, you just can't. So, and that's one reason why couples therapy in the traditional sense almost never works. I am not an advocate of couples therapy. I have just never seen it work. Now, sex therapy is a different thing. Couples therapy oftentimes ignores the very sexual stuff that's so important. And that's it's the hidden agenda in the relationship. I've had couples come in and we need help. And I try to dig into the sexual part. Boy, it's like you hit a brick wall right there. That is one no-go area. Well, if you can't talk about the very thing that's probably underlying the whole dissatisfaction, then you're not going to get anywhere. I hope that answers a little bit of that.
Yeah, I think there's so many things to unpack in one sense, but I think the message that I'm getting is that you, like you said, you have to focus first on yourself. You're your first and possibly last sex partner, but just as you really heal from religious trauma and from purity culture, you realize that there's so many options that you haven't been allowed to consider, whether they're with actual people or just in the your fantasy world. But just giving yourself that freedom. And I think for me, one of the biggest things that I would see as a takeaway from this, and I've kind of thought through myself a lot, is just you need to learn to embrace eroticism, like just the pure raw eroticism of your body and your mind and your life. Like it's really important. It's one of the most freeing things, and I think I'm still on that journey to figure out the best way to do that in my mind. But I've given myself freedom. And one of the things that I love is that I can masturbate with absolutely no shame now. Like deconversion took all the shame away. It's just gone. Like I'm completely happy having a fantasy life in my mind. I'm completely happy masturbating, and there's no part of me that says you shouldn't be doing this. But I know that for some people that alone is a big step, but just
It is.
embracing eroticism, like really thinking of yourself as a hypersexual person, and not that you're not like a person that occasionally jumps into sexuality for a few minutes and then jumps back out. Like you're a sexual person all the time. And I know that there's that cliche, men think about sex, whatever is it, once an hour or whatever. Like I've given myself that freedom, like think about sex a lot. And I know with
Mhm.
purity culture and modesty culture, there's that sense of like, don't look at a woman twice. If you catch and she's got cleavage showing, if you saw it by accident, once, like that's understandable. But if you keep glancing back 2 and 3 times, that's your fault. But to say like, no, like give yourself the freedom. It's perfectly okay to look 2, 3, 4 times on purpose. It's not a bad thing to think that's arousing, that's beautiful, and there's nothing wrong with thinking I want to look at that. But to give yourself that freedom, you really do have to do some deprogramming and reprogramming to get to that level.
And both sides have to do a lot of deprogramming and reprogramming. I totally agree.
Hmm.
The ability to be comfortable with yourself is a lifelong journey. I don't think you stops at any time. And environment can have a real impact on how you're expressing your sexuality. For example, and this is an important example, what I have noticed in both men and women, and I want to underline the women part of this, the use of pornography goes up far more as people are going through a divorce or a breakup because that their bodies are horny as hell. There's no sexual outlet. They want to do something with that. They're almost compelled. It's like an appetite. Of course, it's an appetite. So I see the porn use go up, and that is when people oftentimes are identified by religious leaders as porn addicts. No, you're not a porn addict. You're trying to deal with your body's response to the loss of a partner or the loss of a relationship. Hormonally, your body is saying, "What just happened?" I'm looking around. Now, I'm talking in terms of very primitive brain functions here. Your brain's looking around, said, "What happened to the person who used to be here all the time?" The brain doesn't, "Oh, yeah, I'm going through a divorce." That's not what the brain's doing. The brain's saying something is missing. And the response to that is the same thing as what happens when you put a monkey in a cage away from its troop. The monkey will start masturbating, and it will masturbating at incredibly high rates. Social isolation. If you look in a prison, I used to work in the prison system. My first 10 years or so of my career, I was actually a psychologist within the correctional. And what I noticed was inside of that prison, inside of those cells, men are masturbating all the fucking time because they're lonely. They're socially isolated. They have no sexual outlet. It is not abnormal. That is a normal response, the body and the brain's normal response to social isolation. And when you're going through a divorce, you're feeling incredibly lonely and socially isolated. Now, in the process of finding somebody else and reconnecting, people can do things that are inappropriate, that may be harmful to other people. People are desperate they're desperate to fill that hole again. And that's my caution to people that are going through relationship breakups. That is when you're most likely to make a decision you'll regret later. You'll get in bed with somebody you shouldn't be in bed with. You'll remarry the alcoholic you just divorced. I mean, I've seen this over and over again. People make choices they regret later. I'm not going to call them bad choices. They're choices you're making with the best information, the best tools you have at that time in your life. But I'm hoping through what we're doing right now to help some people avoid those pitfalls that I see in so many people. Now, once you've gotten out of a relationship, you're feeling your body and brain are starting to get rebalanced, and you find another relationship, you start bonding out of this. The key is how do you negotiate the relationship in those early stages so you don't get stuck 4 years from now in a sexless marriage again. Sexless marriages are so damn common. There's there's actually evidence that up to 60% of marriages are sexless after 20 years.
Wow.
That may not even be an exaggeration. Now, by sexless, they means sexual relations, sexual behavior, a sexual act once a month or less. If you're in a relationship where you're having sex once a month or less, you're in what is defined as a sexless relationship. Well, if I told you I don't know when you got married, but whenever you got married, let's say you got married at 25 years old, and I came up to you and said, congratulations, you got married, have a great 4 years, because that's the best sex you're going to have. And in 10 years, you won't be having sex at all. What would you say to me?
It's so sad to think about.
Well,
What a horrible prediction.
I want to be an honest behaviorist here.
Yeah.
I want you to realize where you're going to go with your life.
Hmm.
What if I said, hey, you got 4 or 5 years of good sex here, and then it's start going to decline, and by 10 years you won't be having sex unless you learn how to use pornography, unless you and your partner learn how to use sex toys, unless you and your partner learn how to go watch erotic movies together. Unless there are lots of things you can do to keep a relationship vibrant sexually. And quite frankly, once the sex dies, the bonding starts breaking apart, and you end up being sister and brother, just living together.
Yeah.
And that's so unfulfilling. Now, at 80 years old, you may want to be you may want to be sister and brother. That's okay, because the hormones aren't there. The sexual interest, the sexual energy is not there. The guy can't get an erection like he used to, or as good an erection, or she's got a job, she's dry when she can't seem to get wet. Well, there's things you can do even at 80. I know ADP. I'm fucking 73 years old and I'm still having good sex. It ain't daily like it used to be. It's twice a week, but I'm still happy about that.
Yeah. Well, I feel like
Anyway,
I was gonna say I've asked you a lot of questions, and I was gonna ask if I could. I know we've probably gone over here, but I had a quick comment to make, and then I wanted to ask if you could respond to it if you'd like to, and then just maybe bring us home to any final thoughts you had on the agenda for to kind of they're related to what we talked about. But one thing I just wanted to comment is that it is such a beautiful thing to think about, not just focusing on what do I need and where do I need to go with this thought, but it's such a beautiful thing to think about being the kind of partner that respects someone else enough to say, I understand that this is a human journey, that you are struggling. You're struggling with the sexual pressure, with the sexual stress. You're struggling with the emotions of changing your worldview. You're struggling with the sense of like, if I go too far with this, am I going to lose the relationship because I was too open, whatever. You're struggling with all these things, and it doesn't feel very safe to you. But to be the kind of person that just says, you know what, I'm going to do everything I can to be the kind of partner to you that just says, number one, of course, I want to be romantic and playful and loving and tender, but also I want to give you the freedom to please tell me, like, be honest. I don't want a facade. I want to know the true you. I want to know, what do you think about these things? What do you need to thrive sexually? And just to say, if I can, I'll bend over backwards to meet you where you're at and to make it safe and to please you. And there might be a sense in which maybe someone wants to go a different direction where it's just way too much. They want constant threesomes or something, and maybe somebody's like, no, I'm not going that way. But as long as I can meet you where you're at, I want to try to make this safe for you. And I think that background is that description is so divergent from, it's such a strong contrast from where I've come from, where I think it's just so many Christian men know that you just don't be honest with yourself about, or with other people, about what's in your own heart. I remember being in the guys' dorms at Lancaster Bible College, and we would talk openly. You have these Bible study meetings, and they'd always end up going to, how are you doing with masturbation? How's your thought life? Like that was what the Bible studies was about, is how's your thought life? Are you being pure? And I'm thinking, like, these are guys that are getting degrees to become pastors, and most likely a lot of them will be, in 2 or 3 years, will be either an assistant or a senior pastor at a medium or even large church. and some of them may or may not get married, so they may have a sexual outlet, some of them may not, but they're going into this thinking, I feel like a complete fraud. Like, I know I believe in Jesus and I want to preach the message, I want to share the gospel, I want to build up the church, but on my private life side, I feel like a fraud. And like, if you could have a hidden camera in my mind or in my dorm, you would think to me, you would say to me, you're completely disqualified as a leader of this church. And even though we've, escaped Christianity, there's still that sense of like, I just can't be honest. And the beauty of a partner saying, like, seriously, I want you to be honest. Where are you with your sexuality? And I will not judge you. It's such a beautiful gift. I hope that if I'm ever in such a situation again, that I can give that gift to someone else. And it blows my mind to think about how beautiful it could be for someone to hear those words who's always been thinking, I better not tell the truth, to say, oh, like, really, I can actually be myself. Wow. That could be one of the most healing things, whether you do something with it or not. That could be one of the most healing experiences of your life.
The truth is incredibly threatening to a culture that's built on lies.
Yeah.
And that's what you're experiencing in what people experience in Christianity. It's also what you experience in other religions as well, whether it's Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism. They're all based upon fundamental lies about how the world works. As I stay right front, the very first chapter of my book, Sex and God, there is nothing in Christianity that's biologically sound. Nothing. I mean, where in the Bible does it talk about how your hormones influence the status of your mind at any given time? It doesn't. So if we can be, actually, the last 5 chapters of my book, and I know I'm sitting here talking about my book a lot. And the reason I'm talking about it is because I wrote the damn thing to help people. If you don't read it, I can't help you. And I can't be your therapist. I mean, right here, I can't be your therapist, but I can give you some places to look. And what I did in the last 5 chapters of my book is I wrote those with couples in mind. The whole book tries to show you what other cultures do, what other people do, what other sexual practices there are. And nobody's getting struck by lightning because they're practicing this over in Malaysia or in Indonesia or in Amazonian jungles. Nobody's getting struck by lightning there, and they've been doing this for thousands of years. So let's be honest about what human sexuality is. And then the last 5 chapters are chapters written to help couples ask the right questions about their sexuality, start actually exploring where they are. I mean, you could be committed for the rest of your life, but still be in very different sexual desire states. I mean, a woman who's working full time and has 4 children at home or 3 children or whatever, and has other obligations, probably isn't going to be as turned on or as easy to get turned on. Let's talk out loud about that, because I want to stay with you. I'm speaking, metaphorically. I want to stay with you, and I don't want to be miserable in my own sexuality. I'm not going to be as good a partner if I am miserable. So let's negotiate. Let's figure this out. That is really hard to do if you're still in the Christian framework, because that's verboten. Variety is not permitted. You can't even think about sex. As you said, these ministers, every one of those hormonal college students, including you, were filled with hormones, and they masturbated that morning before they went to Bible study that night. And yet they have to sit around and say, oh, no, I'm not masturbating. Or I asked Jesus for forgiveness after I did it. I won't do it again. That's the kind of bullshit it's in my first book, The God Virus, I talk about the guilt cycle. It's the guilt cycle. It constantly makes you feel guilty about being a normal human being. When you feel guilty, you have to come back to Jesus to get forgiveness. So it keeps you infected with the Christian God virus, or whatever the God virus you have, whether it's Catholicism or Islam, I don't care. The technique is the same. It's called the guilt cycle. And it just keeps running around your head. It keeps you chained to that religion through your own sexuality. That's why all major religions are interested in your sexuality, because that's what keeps you involved in the religion. And we didn't talk about this earlier, but I'm going to just throw this out here. Please do what I'm telling you to right now, Tim. And listener, please do what I'm telling you to. Be careful. Do not think of a red elephant. Most people heard those words, conjured up a red elephant in their brain, says, "Oh, Darrel said not to do that." That's what religion does. Do not think about sex. Do not think about sex. Do not think about sex. And every time that happens, your brain went right there. It's simply taking advantage of your propensity to think about sex, whether you're male or female. I don't care whether a male thinks about once a day or once an hour, or females do. Doesn't matter. Women think about sex, men think about sex. And religion keeps us focused on sex to control us and make us feel guilty and come back to Jesus. That's the system. It's a very simple psychological concept,
Hmm.
and every major religion uses it.
I said I was going to make that one last comment and then have you wrap up, but I wanted to add one more comment if I could, and I'd love for you to comment on this too, and then we'll go to the wrap up. One thing that surprises me as I've thought through my deconversion is that when you look at arguments against pornography, for example, from a Christian perspective, especially, they would say things such as, and I alluded to this before, but among the other issues, such as it's displeasing to God, they would say a fantasy life, it doesn't enable you to focus on the beauty of what you actually have. So in other words, you want the porn star mentality, but then when you get to the real person, they're not perfect and all this, they're not always up for it. So therefore you don't feel as happy with them. And so they would say your fantasy life can actually keep you from enjoying your real life. And what was ironic to me was when I really processed my deconversion was that these people saying this, saying don't pursue fantasy because it ruins your real life, they're focused on the sexual fantasy part, but they're fantasizing about the bigger picture of the whole universe. They're in this grand fantasy, and they're willing to fantasize about this divine marriage and this divine husband and this whole thing. And it's like people who are addicted to the biggest fantasy of all are telling people with this little, one part of your life, one of many, but one important part of your life, saying don't you fantasize about this, even though we're fantasizing about absolutely everything. And it's helped me to realize that they really are disqualified from talking about this topic, number one, but also that they're living in a fantasy that it disenables them, to use their logic, it disenables them from being able to enjoy their one real life. And it's like, just
Right.
like you might say, well, you as a man who watches porn, you can't enjoy your real wife. Well, you can't enjoy your real life because you're fantasizing about heaven. This is like your spiritual orgasm that you're addicted to, that you want it. And it's basically, Christianity ends up becoming basically spiritual porn. And just like somebody would say, oh, I'm a sex addict, I need to masturbate 3 times a day, they need to pray 3-4 times a day, they need to read their Bible 3-4 times a day, go to the Christian websites and all this. And it's like, do you not see, like, those of you who are this toxic with your fantasy are talking to other people who are trying to be so healthy and arguably enjoying fantasies that are quite healthy? You're telling us not to when you're on like steroids fantasy. And it
Yep.
really helped me to figure out, moving past their worldview and just saying, in many ways, like, they're just disqualified from these discussions. It really helped me to heal a lot, to think about it. And honestly, too, I think, just bring it to my situation, and I don't want to make this about my story at all, but I've really realized that when you look at Christians' theology about the importance of Jesus, Jesus says, you need to love me more than anything, more than mother, father, husbands, wives, children, lands, houses. If you don't love me more than anything else, you're not worthy to be my disciple. And there is a real strong sense in which Christians are literally saying to, even Christians in a happy marriage, probably, but they're basically saying, my marriage to Jesus, my relationship with Jesus is so much more important than to you. And so, like, you kind of, comedically alluded to, it's a threesome, but it's also this sense of like, you're competing. You're competing, and they're going to dress better. Just like somebody, if they're out on a date with you and they don't really care about you, they might dress in, some old clothes, some ratty old clothes. But if there's some really nice person that they're like, I really would love to end up with that person, they're going to dress to the nines and make sure that they're really on their best behavior because they want that relationship to work. And we're kind of like seeing people do this exact thing with spirituality. They want their relationship with Jesus to be par excellence, and you're kind of second fiddle, even as
Yeah.
a Christian spouse. And I've noticed that it's one of the most heartbreaking things to realize. They love Jesus more than they will ever love you, even if and since he is a fictional character, they're more in love with fantasy than the reality right in front of them. And it's not really a question, but just a statement. It's so sickening to think about that the one thing that's right in front of them, they'll pass up for the fantasy, and then they'll proceed to tell you,
Oh,
but porn's wrong. Like, oh my gosh.
I, excuse me, I love it. That is a very good framework for understanding what they're living in a fantasy world, a delusion, if you will. And it's so strong that they will deny their own children. I mean, we deal with this all the time. We come from religion, people saying my parents won't talk to me anymore because they're Jehovah's Witnesses or they're Pentecostals and I left the church. So you leave the reality of the real people that are in your life for the fantasy world. And here's another interesting thing we see a lot, and that is people who have been in church their whole life, or they've been in this great church for many years. These best friends, all these people are so supportive and love me, and I love them. The minute you say I don't believe in your Jesus anymore, they're not friends anymore. Wow. They realize, oh, I thought friendship was X. Now I realize it ain't X. They don't want to even talk to me anymore. How could they say they're such good friends and so supportive and turn on me so dramatically? That's all a part of that fantasy they live in. And you've broken the fantasy world. There's a book, I don't know that I recommend it, but I read it years ago. The title alone always meant something to me. It's written by an anthropologist. The book is called The Crack in the Cosmic Egg. The Crack in the Cosmic Egg. And his thesis is simply this. We all are born into a cosmic egg, but sooner or later it cracks. And then you step outside of that crack and oh, there's a bigger cosmos. And then sooner or later you crack that one and there's even bigger cosmos. It's like, almost like an onion, only he's using the egg metaphor. And if you're raised in a fundamentalist or a high control or any kind of religious environment like that, you're within a cosmic egg, but it only takes one or two cracks and the whole thing starts falling apart. What those people are saying, don't crack my egg. You're cracking my egg when you leave and come back and tell me, oh, look how beautiful it is out here in the real world. Don't be doing that. I can't tell you how many hundreds of thousands of people come to us basically saying, man, I saw through the crack in the cosmic egg. It's so beautiful out there. I just went in and went out, and then I got disowned by my whole family
Hmm.
and so forth.
It is heartbreaking. Well, I definitely want to do a follow-up someone. I have a lot more questions and things that I'll be on my mind that I would like to save for you. But just for today, could you give us any final thoughts that you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I do want to make sure, as you know, and said earlier on, the founder of Recovery from Religion, if you have any of the issues we've talked about here today, we're here to help. We're help anybody get through their deconversion process. And we are not here to convert or deconvert. That's not our job. Our job is to listen to you. And as we listen to you, we'll try to help find resources. If your issues around sexuality, if your issues around being shunned, if you're interested how to make friends or how to keep friends that are formerly, all those things, we have hundreds of really well vetted resources we can help you with. So call us at Recover from Religion. It's 184 I doubt it is our phone number, but we have 5 different phone numbers from other English speaking countries, and you can call us on the interwebs. we can accept web calls, so you can get us almost anyway, and you can chat with us. We get at any given morning, I wake up and look on our chat and see somebody chatting in from Germany, from China, not China, from India, from South America, from Argentina. We could have a dozen chats from different countries on any given day. And of course, a lot of them come from the United States, but we're here to help you deal with whatever issues you're facing. Second thing is we have the Secular Therapy Project. If you need more than peer support, more than resources that we got to offer, you can go to seculartherapy.org and find a therapist that won't send you back to church, won't pray with you, won't tell you your problems to Jesus. I don't know how many people have come to me and said that, come to us and said, man, I tried to find a therapist in Dallas, Texas, and they're all religious. I don't want to go to religion. I want somebody that won't shove the Bible down my throat. And I will guarantee you our people won't. We have 821 licensed, evidence-based secular therapists in our database. And when you register as a client on the Secular Therapy Project, you can search, I want to see all the therapists within 50 miles of my house. And a lot of therapists these days will do telehealth. You can do it over the phone or by Zoom or whatever. Anyway, I just want to really emphasize that we are here to help you. And last, of course, take a look at my books, Sex and God and the God Virus. I'm a psychologist. I wrote those books because I saw nobody was writing books to help people deal with the psychological issues that people have. I love Richard Dawkins. I love Sam Harris. I love Daniel Dennett. I loved all those, Christopher Hitchens. They're excellent writers in their field, but not one of them tells you a damn thing about how to deal with the psychological issues that anybody faces leaving a religion that they were born and indoctrinated into. So that's the role I see my books playing, is helping people, as does Recover from Religion. So thanks for having me on, Tim. Really appreciate this today.
I'll have all the links for your books and your websites to Recover from Religion, etc., for your podcast that we referenced at the beginning. I'll have all the links, so please do go like and subscribe and check it all out and buy his books. But again, I'd love to have you back before long. I've got a lot more things on the radar for topics. But thank you. I just want to say thank you for being, what would be the best way to phrase it, a paradigm changer. You're changing the way that we see things and helping us to not just answer a few questions, but actually to say, before you answer these questions, let's go to the much bigger thing of this whole framework you even have to answer the questions. People like that are, to me, an inspiration. So I love it. I love how you help me to just step back from the whole thing and think about it very radically different. Because that's part of deconversion is just like when we were Christians, you don't repent once, you repent over and over and over. When you deconvert, you do deconvert, but you kind of still, you realize there's all these roots that are still deep down, and you have to keep looking and pull them up if you really want to do the hard work and be as healthy as you can. So I love it. I love what you're doing, and thank you so much for today, for sharing your story, and just for all your work. You've been such a game changer for so many of us.
Well, thank you. Let's get out there and crack that cosmic egg.
That's right. Well, I'll wrap up then by saying we've been speaking with Dr. Darrel Ray. Dr. Ray, thank you so much. Great to hear your story. Great to get to know you. And let's do it again sometime.
I'll come back at any time you want me. I love talking about this shit.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right.